The candle flickers in a room that should not exist anymore. A chamber imagined from fragments of memory, smoke, and time. Darkness presses close, soft and heavy, yet within it lies a trembling glow. The flame bends as though reacting to a presence, to the weight of words about to cross the threshold between centuries. Somewhere beyond the walls, the world is silent, but inside this space, a whisper begins to rise, not from a living throat, but from parchment so old it should have turned to dust. The voice does not arrive suddenly. It gathers, the way embers gather heat before bursting into fire. It feels cautious, wary, as if unsure whether it is truly permitted to return. And then, with the low hum of something ancient and patient, the words surface. They sound worn, weathered by the elements of memory and time. A Templar speaks, or perhaps the echo of one. His tone steady yet carrying a sorrow buried deeper than any grave. He speaks not to kings or courts or foes, but to the listener, the stranger from an unimaginable future. His voice feels like a hand placed gently on a shoulder, firm enough to steady, soft enough not to startle. He begins with loss. Not the loss of wealth or land or battles, those are trivial to men trained to die young, but the loss of certainty. He describes the moment when faith feels like sand slipping between fingers, when everything he believed immutable shatters in a single night. The scrape of torches along stone corridors, the sound of armored feet rushing like a storm, the sudden transformation of brothers into prisoners. These images come to life as though they are unfolding now, flickering with the candlelight. Yet even as he speaks of fear, his voice carries an odd stillness, as if he has had centuries to make peace with what happened. He tells of a message he wrote in the final days of the Order, a message he believed would be swallowed by flames. He speaks of writing it not for himself, not even for his fellow knights, but for someone he could not name, someone who would find it when the world was breaking them too. He admits he never expected these words to survive. He imagined them curling into smoke, rising toward a sky that would forget them. And yet, by some impossible path, they have returned, carried across generations by a thread so thin it could easily have snapped. The air grows warmer as the voice deepens, no longer fragile, now more certain of its right to be heard. He speaks about resilience, not as a virtue, but as a necessity, a craft shaped through wounds and failures. He describes nights in foreign deserts where silence felt like a companion, and pain felt like a teacher. At times, the voice trembles, not from fear but from the weight of remembering. Yet every tremble is followed by strength, as though the speaker refuses to allow the past to dim the meaning of what survived. He talks about brothers who stood beside him, men who carried more burdens than any sword could match. He speaks of their quiet courage, the kind that leaves no stories in chronicles, no songs in halls, yet changes the shape of those who witness it. His words fill the dim room like rising smoke, and suddenly the listener can feel the heat of a distant battlefield, the cold stone of a prison cell, the warmth of camaraderie forged in the harshest of worlds. But underneath it all lies a deeper truth. This is not a war story. This is a message for the broken. The voice acknowledges the listener directly now, stepping across the centuries with unsettling clarity. He talks about moments when life leaves a person on their knees, unsure if they have the strength to rise again. And in that acknowledgement, his tone shifts from sorrow to guidance. He invites the listener to breathe, to pause, to recognize that survival is not an act of defiance but an act of becoming. He admits that he himself broke many times, that the world stripped him of armor, title, and absolutes. Yet each time, something within him rebuilt, slowly, quietly, like dawn pushing through ruins. His words feel less like history and more like a lantern placed in a trembling hand. As the candle flickers, the voice grows softer, as if retreating back toward its origin, but not before leaving behind a final lingering truth, that strength is not granted, but discovered, not taught, but unearthed. And those who lived through fire have something to teach those facing their own. The flame leans, shadows stretch, and the room feels suddenly colder, as though the presence has stepped back. But the echo remains, suspended in the air. A promise, a warning, and an invitation. When life breaks you down, Let these words build you back up. The past is not gone. It is only sleeping, and tonight, it has awakened to speak. The night did not fall gently over Paris. It crashed like a closing gate. A low, unnatural hush rolled through the narrow streets, the kind of quiet that precedes catastrophe. Citizens sensed it first, though they could not name it. Shutters closed early, candles dimmed, and whispers clung to the cold autumn air. Somewhere deep in the city, a bell tolled once, then stopped, as if silenced by an unseen hand. But in the Templar commandery, the brothers felt nothing at all. They were accustomed to long nights, to prayer, to the rhythmic pattern of discipline. They had no reason to suspect that by dawn, their world would be destroyed. It began with the distant echo of boots. Too many, moving too fast, striking the stones with a harsh metallic clang. At first, the knights mistook it for a patrol or perhaps a late-arriving caravan of pilgrims. But the sound grew louder, sharper, harsher, until it no longer resembled footsteps but the advance of an army. Torches appeared at the far end of the courtyard walls, their flames twitching violently in the cold air. Shadows danced across the stone, multiplying, crawling upward like the fingers of a rising fire. The men guarding the entrance stiffened, but before a challenge could be spoken, a royal seal glinted in the torchlight. The king's soldiers surged forward. They moved with a precision that could not be improvised. This was a plan rehearsed in secrecy, executed with ruthless certainty. Iron struck against iron as gates were forced open. Horses stamped impatiently, their breath steaming like smoke from beasts preparing to charge. The Templars, trained to remain calm even in chaos, struggled to understand. No warning, no message from the Pope, no justification, only orders from King Philip IV, arrest every Templar, seize every document, confiscate every chest, and extinguish the order before sunrise. Shock rippled through the ranks. Knights who had faced Saracen armies without trembling now felt an unfamiliar chill crawl along their spines. Betrayal has a different sound than battle. Quieter, heavier, like a door closing forever. The Templar commanders tried to negotiate, asking for the charges. But the soldiers only repeated the same rehearsed lie. Heresy, corruption, unspeakable sins. Words sharp enough to cut reputations, not men. And yet, the real truth was far simpler and far uglier. The king was drowning in debt and the Templars were the largest bank in Europe. Torches illuminated faces filled with disbelief. The brothers, bound by vows and brotherhood, looked at one another for answers none of them could give. Some reached instinctively for the hilts of their swords, but discipline held them back. They had sworn obedience, sworn peace within the lands of Christendom. To raise arms against the king would condemn them before the world. So they stood still as shackles clamped around their wrists, the iron cold and humiliating. Inside the commandery, soldiers smashed open chests, scattering scrolls and relics across the floor. Sacred texts were seized. Ledgers documenting decades of service were thrown into bags as though they were contraband. The air filled with the scent of wax, dust, and the sharp tang of fear. One knight, older than the rest, whispered a prayer under his breath, not for salvation, but for understanding. How could loyalty be twisted into treason? How could the protectors of pilgrims become prisoners overnight? As the soldiers dragged the men from their home, the night seemed to widen, absorbing their confusion and despair. Some citizens watched from darkened windows, unable to reconcile what they were seeing. These were the warriors who had defended Christendom for 2 centuries. These were men celebrated in songs, feared in battle, respected even by kings. And yet here they were, marched through the streets like criminals, their white mantles stained by torchlight and dirt. Among the captives was the mysterious Templar who would someday leave behind the manuscript, the voice that now speaks across centuries. He walked in silence, eyes fixed ahead, but inside him a storm raged. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, the shattering of certainty. He had survived battlefields, deserts, and sieges, yet this night cut him in a way no blade ever could. The enemy was not foreign. It was his own king, As the column of prisoners disappeared down the street, a gust of wind extinguished a torch left burning by the gate. Smoke spiraled upward like a fading signal, dissolving into the dark sky. The Templars' world had been broken in a single night, torn apart not by war, but by politics, greed, and betrayal. And yet, beneath that devastation, something else took root. The first spark of the words he would one day write. Words born from ashes. Words meant for someone far beyond his own time. Words that would outlive the flames that consumed his order. What secret did they carry that was so dangerous, so threatening, that a king would risk everything to erase it? The knight offered no answer. Only the promise that the truth, buried under chains and darkness, had only just begun to reveal itself. A Templar's life did not begin with glory, or with the weight of a sword. It began in silence, a silence that pressed as tightly as the cloister walls that surrounded their training. Before they were warriors, they were monks, and before they were monks, they were simply men searching for a purpose strong enough to anchor their restless spirits. Many were the second sons of noble families, men who would never inherit land or titles. Others were wanderers seeking absolution from mistakes no one else knew. Some came because they believed God had whispered their name. Others came because nowhere else felt like home. Their transformation started the moment they stepped into the austere hall where their vows would later be spoken. Rows of white mantles hung like ghosts on wooden pegs. The air carried the scent of old stone and candle smoke. A simple wooden cross dominated the far wall. Not ornate, not adorned, just a reminder that their lives were no longer their own. A recruit would stand there, knees trembling slightly from the weight of what he was choosing. The brothers would gather around him, faces solemn, voices firm as they asked, "Do you understand the burden of this path?" The burden was immense. Poverty meant surrendering all possessions, even personal memories in the form of keepsakes. Chastity meant giving up every chance for family, for warmth, for the tenderness of a shared life. Obedience meant placing one's will into the hands of the order forever. But beyond the vows was something deeper, the unspoken understanding that this life would demand a kind of courage that had nothing to do with battle. It required the courage to face oneself. Once accepted, the recruits were shaped slowly, not through brutality but through discipline sharper than any blade. Dawn began before sunrise, when the sky was still a pale bruise. Their first lessons were not in combat but in humility. They scrubbed floors, carried water, tended to the poor, and prayed until their knees felt fused to the ground. The idea was simple. A knight who cannot kneel cannot rise with honor. A knight who cannot serve cannot lead. Only later did the training turn toward the sword. And when it did, it was relentless. They practiced until their arms shook, until sweat soaked through wool and froze in the cold morning air. Their blades struck wooden posts, straw targets, and eventually the shields of fellow brothers who refused to yield an inch. Each clang echoed through the stone courtyards like a heartbeat, steady, disciplined, unwavering. But even here, the sword was not the true lesson. The sword was merely the test. The real strength they sought was the ability to remain calm in storm, to hold faith when surrounded by death, to protect the innocent even at the cost of their own lives. Their mentors taught them that a Templar was never just a warrior. He was a sanctuary in human form. His presence was meant to give comfort on the road to Jerusalem, to inspire courage in the hearts of pilgrims who trembled at tales of ambushes and desert bandits. To the world, they wore armor. But within the order, they were instructed to carry compassion like a second blade, sharp enough to cut through fear. Yet contradictions lived at the center of their existence. They were monks who killed, men of peace who marched into war, servants of God who learned to end lives with efficiency. This duality carved deep lines in their souls. At night, after hours of training, many whispered the same question to the darkness. Can a man serve two masters, the sword and the spirit? Some found answers. Others carried the question like a stone in their chest. But all understood that the brotherhood required something greater than resolve. It required surrender to a destiny far larger than any individual life. Over months and years, the novices hardened into knights. Their backs straightened, Their footsteps became measured and silent. Their eyes learned to carry both softness and steel. And when they finally wore the white mantle marked with the red cross, they felt the full weight of it settle over their shoulders. Heavier than armor, heavier than duty. It was the symbol of men who stood where others fled, who marched where others faltered. This was the world that shaped the anonymous Templar whose voice would one day travel across centuries. Before he faced betrayal, before he wrote the words that survived fire, he had been a young man trying to understand how to carry both a monk's purity and a warrior's fury in a single fragile heart. It was in this tension, this impossible balance, that his true strength began to form, long before he ever knew how much he would need it. And it was this foundation, forged in prayer, sweat, and silence, that made the collapse of the order not just a political downfall, but a spiritual shattering. One that would echo in every word he later wrote for those who would face their own breaking. They carried more weight than their armor ever revealed. For the outside world, a Templar was a symbol of certainty, a tower of faith, discipline, and purpose. But beneath the white mantle, beneath the hard-set jaw and sharpened gaze, lived a human being who felt everything far more deeply than he was ever allowed to show. The order demanded not only strength, but silence. Not only courage, but the refusal to admit fear. In their world, emotions were not enemies, but they were shadows that had to be controlled, contained, and buried until they no longer threatened duty. From the moment a knight rose before dawn, the weight began pressing inward. He carried the weight of the vows he had sworn, vows that could not be broken without shattering the very identity he lived within. Poverty meant no comforts, no safety nets, no belongings to anchor him. Chastity meant a life without tenderness, without affection, without the warmth of a family waiting at home. Obedience meant surrendering every decision, every instinct, even every doubt, to the will of the order. The world saw their vows as noble. The knights knew the truth. These vows were a slow unraveling of the self, a constant chiseling away of personal desire until only duty remained. The battlefield added its own burden, a fire that burned the spirit as fiercely as it burned the flesh. A Templar rode into every battle knowing he was expected not simply to fight but to be the last man standing. They were the vanguard, the shield, the unwavering line that could never retreat. But courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was the act of moving forward despite carrying fear like a stone lodged beneath the ribs. Many knights died with their hearts pounding not from bravery, but from the terror they had learned to mask behind their helmets. Those who survived carried that terror home, tucked deep inside their silence. Prayer was meant to soothe them, yet even prayer carried its own weight. Every night, after the clanging of swords had faded and the fires dimmed, the brothers knelt in dimly lit chapels. Their voices rose in unison, steady and disciplined, but beneath the harmony lay individual storms no one dared speak aloud. Some prayed for forgiveness for the men they had killed. Some prayed for the strength not to break under expectations. Some prayed because they feared what their lives would become if they stopped. And some prayed in desperation, begging God to hear them through the noise of their duty. Guilt clung to them like dust from the desert roads. Knights were taught that taking a life for the protection of the innocent was righteous, yet each man felt the sting differently. Some carried the faces of fallen enemies in their dreams. Others replayed the screams of dying comrades. In the silence between battles, the memories grew louder. They could speak of courage, of honor, of divine purpose, but rarely of pain. It was easier to polish armor than admit the cracks forming underneath it. There was also the weariness, a deep, bone-heavy exhaustion that no sleep could cure. The order demanded constant readiness. One night in a warm bed might be followed by a week in the saddle. A moment of peace could be shattered by a horn's cry. Their bodies healed slowly, their spirits healed slower. Many knights learned to endure their fatigue the way they endured hunger or thirst, stoically, without complaint. But exhaustion has a way of wearing down even the strongest resolve, and in quiet moments, some wondered if their faith was enough to sustain them. Yet, in the midst of these pressures, there was something else they carried, something that made all the weight bearable. Brotherhood. In a world that asked them to abandon everything, The brothers were the one thing they were allowed to hold on to. A hand steadying a trembling arm before battle. A shared look that said, "I understand," without a single word. A moment of quiet laughter around a fire, reminding them that they were still human beneath the iron discipline. But even brotherhood had its limits. The harder the world pressed against the order, the harder the knights pressed their emotions inward. They were taught to be stone, but stones crack when enough pressure is applied. And the Templars were no exception. Their burdens accumulated year after year, until the soul of even the strongest knight began to ache beneath the armor. For the unnamed Templar whose words would one day reach across centuries, these burdens shaped him in ways he could not yet understand. The emotional weight he carried became the forge that tempered his spirit. The guilt, the exhaustion, the conflict between faith and violence. All of it carved deep channels inside him, places where wisdom would gather later like rain. He did not know then that the same pressures threatening to break him were the very forces that would teach him resilience. That the wounds he hid would eventually become the insights he would write for others facing their own darkness. Before the betrayal, before the arrest, before the fire that would consume the order, the knights lived under the crushing weight of their own humanity, and it was this unspoken burden that gave depth, sorrow, and fierce compassion to the voice that would someday speak through time. The manuscript lay before scholars like a riddle wrapped in smoke, a fragile, brittle thing that should not have survived the centuries. Yet here it was, stubborn as a heartbeat that refuses to die. No name marked its beginning, no signature sealed its end. Only silence, only symbols. The absence of identity was deliberate, almost defiant, as if the writer knew that attaching a name would doom the message to the same flames that consumed countless Templar records. Those who first examined the parchment noticed something strange. The handwriting did not belong to a scribe. It was steady but not ornate, clear but not decorative. It carried the rhythm of a man used to writing in haste, perhaps in secrecy, perhaps in fear. The ink had faded into a soft brown, and the parchment bore small scorch marks, suggesting it had once been close to fire, close enough to blister but not enough to destroy. Some believed this meant the writer had entrusted the manuscript to someone moments before destruction. Others argued it had been hidden in stone walls, spared by chance or providence. What truly bewildered scholars were the symbols scattered throughout the text, small markings between lines, in margins, or tucked into the corners like whispered secrets. These symbols resembled the ciphers used by the Templars in their coded correspondences. A mixture of geometric shapes, abbreviated letters, and curious marks with no immediate connection to the Latin words beside them. Templars were known to protect their financial records and strategic communications with layered codes. But this manuscript was not a ledger, nor a military report. The coded markings appeared beside passages that felt emotional, reflective, or spiritual. It was almost as if the author could not bear to write certain thoughts openly. Perhaps they were confessions too heavy for the page. Perhaps they were truths too dangerous for anyone of that time to speak aloud. One symbol appeared repeatedly, a thin diagonal line intersected by 3 short horizontal marks. Some compared it to a stylized ladder, others to an incomplete cross. Yet the unnamed author placed it beside sentences that spoke of falling, rising, breaking, and rebuilding. It was as if this symbol represented something deeply personal, a private sign for endurance. Scholars began calling it the Mark of Rising, though none could prove its meaning. Another symbol, a small spiral with a dot in its center, appeared only 4 times. It was found next to lines about inner silence, about listening for God not in the sky but in the quiet of one's own suffering. Some speculated it symbolized introspection or the turning inward of the spirit. Others believed it referred to a secret meditative practice whispered among certain Templar circles, a practice rumored but never documented, suggesting the author was not only recording wisdom but protecting it through code. What made the manuscript even stranger was the tone of the writing. It did not read like a chronicle of battles or a philosophical treatise. Instead, it felt like a voice speaking directly to the reader, stripped of pretense, raw and honest. The author spoke of fear, doubt, brokenness, and the unbearable weight of expectations, subjects no Templar would dare confess publicly. The manuscript seemed to offer not only memory but guidance, as though the writer expected the reader to be someone who had endured great suffering. This raised a troubling question. Who was it written for? The manuscript made no mention of specific brothers, no direct address, no dedication. Instead, it carried a tone of timelessness, as though the author wrote for someone he would never meet, someone who might find the document in an age far removed from his own. It was a voice stretching through shadows, seeking a listener not yet born. Some scholars theorized that the author was a high-ranking Templar, aware of the order's coming destruction, writing a secret spiritual guide for those who might rise after the ashes. Others argued he was a low-ranking brother with nothing to lose, writing honestly because anonymity was the only shield he had left. A few believed he was a prisoner who knew he had days left to live, pouring his soul into words because words were the only thing the king could not torture or burn into silence. Then came the most haunting theory, that the manuscript had been written collectively, that the symbols were signatures of different knights contributing their pieces of suffering, hope, and wisdom, a chorus disguised as a single voice. But within the text, one thing was unmistakable. The author, whether one man or many, understood pain intimately. He wrote about the moment when faith bends under the weight of despair, when duty becomes a chain, when courage feels like a memory instead of a flame. He wrote about losing everything, yet finding something hidden beneath the ruin. A strength so quiet, so steady, it could not be taken by kings or fear or fire. This manuscript was not a confession. It was not a prophecy. It was a map through the darkness, drawn by someone who had walked the same path and returned not unscathed, but unbroken. As scholars turned each fragile page, they realized something profound. Perhaps the reason the author chose anonymity was not to protect himself, but to ensure that his message belonged to anyone who needed it. In hiding his name, he gave his voice to all the broken souls who would one day listen. And so the mystery deepened. This unnamed Templar had decided that identity was unimportant. What mattered was the message that burned quietly beneath the ink, a message that would outlive the flames that tried to consume it, waiting patiently for the day someone would understand why it had been written at all. The desert does not welcome visitors, it tests them. For the Templars who marched across the sweltering lands of the Levant, the desert was not just a landscape but an opponent, a teacher, and at times, a mirror reflecting the deepest parts of themselves. The unnamed Templar, whose voice would one day survive through brittle pages, wrote of these marches with a tone that lingered between awe and exhaustion. He described the desert not as scenery, but as a living force that stripped men down to the core of what they were. The heat was the first enemy. It was not the warmth of European summers, but a relentless blaze that pressed against skin and armor until everything felt like fire. Iron helmets grew hot enough to burn foreheads. Leather straps bit into shoulders softened by sweat. Horses struggled for breath, tongues swollen, eyes glazed. Even the shadows offered no comfort, for the air shimmered with a heat that blurred the horizon and twisted distances into cruel illusions. The Templar wrote of moments when the line between ground and sky disappeared, when the world looked like molten sand drifting endlessly. At night, the desert reversed itself without mercy. The heat vanished and left a cold that sliced through flesh and bone. The wind howled like a beast prowling the dunes, carrying with it the sting of fine sand that slipped beneath cloaks and grated against eyelids. Fires crackled weakly, barely keeping back the darkness. The brothers huddled together, sharing body heat, their breath rising in pale clouds under a sky crowded with stars. It was in these nights that the Templar felt closest to himself. Stripped of war cries, stripped of duty, forced into silence by the sheer immensity of the world above him. He wrote about the desert as if it could hear prayers. Some men begged for water, others begged for survival, others, secretly, begged for peace. The kind of peace they feared they would never find on a battlefield or within their own conflicted souls. The desert did not grant answers. It only listened with ancient indifference. But in that indifference, the Templar found something unexpected: clarity. When everything extraneous was taken away, comfort, routine, stability, what remained were the truths a man could no longer outrun. The marches were long, stretching across days that blended into one another. Their supplies dwindled faster than anticipated. Water skins grew lighter, horses stumbled, some brothers collapsed, their bodies succumbing to the weight of the heat even when their spirits refused to. The living carried the fallen, not out of obligation but out of an unspoken understanding. In the desert, they survived only by refusing to leave each other behind. This was where their brotherhood became something sacred. Not the rituals, not the vows, but the simple act of extending a hand to someone whose knees were buckling. The unnamed Templar wrote of one particular day when a sandstorm rose without warning. The sky darkened as if night had fallen instantly. A wall of swirling gold and blood orange descended upon them with a roar. Visibility vanished. The air became unbreathable. Sand forced its way into mouths, nostrils, ears. Horses screamed, rearing in terror. Men clung to ropes tied around their waists, desperate not to be separated from their brothers. In the chaos, the Templar lost his footing. The world became a spinning blur of grit and wind. For a moment, he believed this was his end. Not in glorious battle, but consumed by sand, nameless and forgotten. But in the heart of the storm, something shifted. The Templar described hearing a voice, not spoken aloud, but rising from deep within, steady and unmistakably calm. It was not divine revelation in the traditional sense. It was a realization, a truth that had always lived in him but had been drowned out by duty, fear, and expectation. The voice told him to move slowly, to breathe deliberately, to trust the rope he held. And he did. Inch by inch, he pulled himself toward the faint pressure at the other end. A brother he could not see but who refused to let go. When the storm finally passed, the men emerged half-buried, coughing, covered in sand. But they were alive, and the Templar wrote that in that moment, he understood something fundamental. Strength was rarely loud. It was quiet, steady, persistent, like a hand pulling you through darkness even when sight had failed. In the days that followed, the desert softened. Dawn painted the dunes in soft rose colors. The wind hummed instead of howled. And for the first time, the Templar wrote of feeling a strange peace, not because the march had grown easier, but because he had discovered within himself a resilience he did not know he carried. The desert had not killed him. It had refined him. He later wrote that every man walks through his own desert at some point in life, a place where the world strips away all comfort, all certainty, leaving only the core of who he is. Some break, some endure, a few are transformed. For the unnamed Templar, the desert was not a chapter of suffering. It was the crucible where his real voice, the one that would one day reach across centuries, began to form. He described the desert not just as a trial of the body, but as a place where a man's inner landscape was carved open. What the heat and wind stripped away, the silence revealed. And in that silence, something unexpected began to take shape. Lessons not taught in the halls of the order, not written in scripture, not whispered by commanders. Lessons written in dust, in exhaustion, in survival itself. They were written by experience, not ink. By pain, not philosophy. The unnamed Templar wrote of those moments when a man stared at the horizon, endless and indifferent, and felt the weight of his own smallness. It was frightening at first, that feeling of insignificance, but then, slowly it became freeing. When the world is too vast to conquer, the only thing left to conquer is the self. And that realization planted the first seed of the teachings that would one day fill his manuscript. He spoke of a moment when the desert wind shifted, soft instead of harsh, warm instead of scorching. It carried the scent of distant greenery, a promise of an oasis still unseen. The brothers had been marching for 3 days with almost no water left. Their lips cracked, their eyes burned, their thoughts drifted dangerously between hope and delirium. But the Templar felt something in that breeze, something he could not yet name. It was the smallest thing, a degree of warmth, a hint of moisture. But in a place where life was constantly threatened, even the faintest shift was a sign worth trusting. That was the first lesson the desert taught him, that hope does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it is a whisper, a breath, a a sensation so subtle that only the exhausted can feel it. Hope, he later wrote, is not the flame, it is the spark. And men break not because the flame dies, but because they lose the ability to recognize the spark. Another lesson came in the form of a fallen brother. One of the younger knights collapsed from dehydration, dropping to his knees as though struck by an unseen blow. His breathing was shallow, his eyes unfocused. The older Templars knew the signs. The desert could claim a man in minutes once his strength gave out. There was no shade, no water, no shelter. They could not carry everyone. Survival demanded brutal decisiveness. But the unnamed Templar refused to walk past him. He knelt beside the young man, propping him up, whispering words the others could not hear. He took the last sip of water from his own skin and pressed it to the brother's lips. The others protested. One man's kindness could doom them all. But the Templar did not waver. Perhaps he didn't fully understand why he acted. Perhaps it was instinct, or compassion, or something deeper. Hours later, just as the brother regained consciousness, the oasis appeared. A glimmering pool surrounded by palms, like a vision made real. The older knights murmured prayers of gratitude. Some claimed divine intervention. Others chalked it up to luck. But the unnamed Templar wrote something else. When we choose humanity over survival, survival sometimes chooses us in return. This line became one of the manuscript's most quoted passages centuries later. It reflected a truth only someone who had stood at the edge of death could articulate. That mercy was not weakness, but strength carved into the soul. He also wrote of silence, the heavy, consuming kind that fell over the camp when the stars stretched across the desert sky. In the order, silence had always been a discipline, a rule, a boundary. But in the desert, silence was a mirror. It forced the men to confront thoughts they had avoided for years. Regrets, fears, questions about faith and fate and forgiveness. The unnamed Templar did not run from these thoughts. For the first time in his life, he listened. And what he heard became the foundation of his teachings. He realized that suffering does not always break a man. Sometimes it reveals him. That the desert, in its brutal honesty, stripped away illusions until all that remained was truth. He wrote about the way footprints in sand vanished within minutes, erased by the wind. At first, he saw this as a symbol of futility, nothing lasting, nothing remembered. But gradually, he understood the opposite. The desert taught impermanence so that a man could learn to let go, to stop gripping the past with white-knuckled desperation, to understand that the world does not carry our burdens for us. We must learn to release them ourselves. Every lesson the desert gave him felt simple, almost ordinary, yet it reshaped him more profoundly than any sermon or lecture. He realized that wisdom is not always found in grand moments. Sometimes it is found in the quiet decisions made when no one is watching. As he marched through endless dunes and slept beneath endless stars, the unnamed Templar began writing fragments of these thoughts in the margins of his travel notes. Hurried lines, half-formed ideas, insights discovered through suffering. These fragments later became the heartbeats of his manuscript. The desert did not only test him, it taught him how to see the world with new eyes, how to rise after falling, how to find meaning in hardship, how to recognize strength where others saw weakness. These were lessons written not in ink, but in dust, lessons that would one day help rebuild others long after the desert had claimed its last footprint. He did not expect the words to come to him the way they did, not as polished thoughts or holy revelations, but as something raw, something human, something painfully honest. For most of his life, the unnamed Templar had believed strength was loud. It was the clash of steel, the echo of command, the firm weight of unshakable faith. But as the desert peeled away the layers of certainty he once wore like armor, he discovered a truth he was never taught. Strength could be quiet. Strength could be soft. Strength could be the simple act of rising, again and again, even when every part of him begged to stay on the ground. The shift in his writing was subtle at first. Notes scribbled between accounts of marches. Short lines formed during nights when sleep refused to come. Observations that felt less like journal entries and more like conversations with himself. He realized he was no longer recording events. He was recording transformations. His own, his brothers, the desert's relentless shaping of their spirits. He wrote of a morning when the sun rose unusually slow, as if reluctant to spill light across the dunes. The brothers woke to a silence that felt different. Not the oppressive stillness of exhaustion, but a quiet that felt expectant. The unnamed Templar watched the horizon glow pale gold, and something inside him softened. He sensed that sunrise was not a command to move, not a signal of duty, but a reminder. Every day that begins is a day that invites you to begin again. It was a simple idea, yet it pierced him deeper than any sermon he had heard in a cathedral. From this moment came one of his earliest teachings. Strength is not the roar of victory, but the breath taken after defeat. He wrote these words almost absent-mindedly, not realizing they would become a guiding line repeated centuries later. They came to him because they felt true, and because he had lived them. The next shift came during a moment of despair. Supplies were running dangerously low. The knights were hungry, weak, sunburned, and weary. Some muttered that they would die in the dunes, forgotten by history, swallowed by sand. That night, the unnamed Templar found himself alone at the edge of the camp, staring at the sky. He remembered battles lost, brothers buried, prayers unanswered. He felt the weight of years pressing on him, the expectation to be fearless, unwavering, unbreakable. But he wasn't. Not anymore. He felt something inside him finally give way. A crack, small but unmistakable. And instead of fighting it, he let it happen. He knelt in the sand, bowed his head, and allowed himself to feel everything he had suppressed for years. Fear, grief, exhaustion, longing. The tears that slipped down his face dried almost instantly in the desert wind, but the release felt like a cleansing, like a dam finally breaking. He wrote of that moment later. To break is not to fail. It is to open the door through which strength enters. This was not the language of a warrior. It was the language of a man finally understanding himself. He was discovering that vulnerability did not weaken him. It grounded him. It humbled him. It made him human again after years of living as a symbol rather than a person. Gradually, the manuscript shifted entirely. The entries stopped focusing on hardship and began focusing on resilience, not as a heroic ideal but as a lived experience. The unnamed Templar began piecing together a quiet philosophy, shaped by deserts and battles and brotherhood, by isolation and prayer and the simple act of surviving another day. He wrote that strength is a cycle, not a state, that falling is part of rising, that a man forged only by victory is fragile, but a man forged by struggle becomes unbreakable. He confessed that he had misunderstood courage for most of his life, that he once believed courage was never showing fear. But now he wrote, "Courage is the decision to walk forward even while fear walks beside you." These lines were not meant to be teachings. Not yet. They were reminders to himself. Reminders to keep moving even when hope felt thin as the line between light and shadow on the horizon at dusk. One night, after tending to a brother who had collapsed from exhaustion, he found himself sitting alone beside the dying fire. His hands were shaking from fatigue, yet his mind was alive with clarity. He realized something profound. He had always believed God demanded strength. But now he understood perhaps God asked only for effort, for trying, for rising. This realization reshaped him. He began looking at his brothers differently. He saw the quiet bravery in the man who limped but kept marching, the resilience of the brother who barely spoke but always helped set up camp, the courage of those who doubted their faith yet continued to pray. Strength was not uniform. It was not predictable. It was a mosaic of small actions repeated day after day. He wrote, "Strength is built from moments others do not see." That line marked the true beginning of the teachings that would eventually form the manuscript's core. It was no longer a record of suffering. It was becoming a guide for the broken, for the weary, for anyone facing their own desert, literal or metaphorical. The unnamed Templar did not yet know how important these words would become. He wrote them simply because he needed them. But in doing so, he created something that would outlast kingdoms, wars, and the destruction of his own order. The desert had forced him to break. And in breaking, he learned how to rebuild. Slowly, steadily, like dawn crawling across the ruins of a long, cold night. It was easy to imagine the Templars as a single unified brotherhood, identical in purpose, belief, and discipline. The world saw them that way. A monolithic order wrapped in white mantles and armed with an unshakable reputation. But behind the stone walls of their commanderies, behind the structured prayers and rigid routines, there existed layers of the order that few outside ever knew about. Layers of quiet seekers, thinkers, wounded souls, and spiritually restless men who found refuge not in the clang of swords, but in each other. These were the ones who formed what later scholars would call the hidden brotherhood. It was not an official division, nor a formal group sanctioned by the masters. No titles, no ranks, no rituals carved in record books. It was a circle formed privately, quietly, almost invisibly. A gathering of men who understood that nights could be broken just as easily as any wanderer or pilgrim. They recognized that battles did not only take place on fields of sand and stone, but also within the boundaries of the human heart. The unnamed Templar belonged to this inner circle. He never stated it plainly in his manuscript, but every line he wrote hinted at it. A brotherhood bound not by strategy or discipline, but by truth shared in moments of vulnerability. What connected these men was not strength, but the acknowledgement of their weakness. They were the ones who stayed awake long after evening prayers, staring into dying flames. They were the ones who prayed not for victory, but for understanding. They were the ones who looked at their brothers and saw the silent cracks beneath the armor. The hidden brotherhood met unofficially, usually in shadowed corners of the commandery, the back of the stables, the quiet edge of the cloister hall, or on rare peaceful nights, beneath open skies where the stars served as the only witnesses. They met in small groups, sometimes only 2 or 3, and spoke in low voices. They did not share battlefield stories. They shared burdens. Some spoke of guilt over the lives they had taken. Others confessed fears they dared not say aloud in the presence of commanders. Some admitted moments of doubt that shook their faith like a storm shaking the frame of a cathedral. No one judged. No one advised. They listened, and in listening they formed a sanctuary within a sanctuary. The unnamed Templar wrote of these meetings with a tenderness rarely found in writings of warriors. He described how a single honest word from a brother could feel like water after days in the desert. How simply being heard was a kind of healing. He wrote that these quiet exchanges saved more men than any medic or priest. That sometimes all a knight needed to keep marching was the knowledge that someone else understood the weight he carried. The hidden brotherhood also had its thinkers, men who explored the spiritual tensions of their dual lives. They questioned how one could kill in the name of peace. They wrestled with the contradiction of monks who wielded swords. They sought ways to reconcile their vows with their reality. In doing so, they developed practices meant to steady the mind and strengthen the soul. One of these practices was a form of contemplation that blended prayer with breath and silence. They would sit in a circle, armor removed, knees drawn close, and breathe deeply until the noise inside their thoughts settled. They believed that stillness sharpened clarity, and clarity strengthened resolve. It was dangerous for knights to admit such vulnerability openly. So this meditation ritual became something known only among those who trusted one another deeply. There were also fragments of teachings, short phrases, metaphors, coded symbols, passed quietly from one brother to another. Not lessons of war, but lessons of endurance, forgiveness, acceptance. These were not meant to contradict the order's rules, but to fill the spiritual gaps that discipline alone could not reach. In these fragments, one finds the earliest echoes of the manuscript's philosophy. Strength in softness, peace in pain, wisdom in suffering. The unnamed Templar observed these quiet practices with an attentive mind. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the stories and confessions of his brothers, storing their struggles inside himself. He did not realize it then, but these quiet nights shaped the words he would later write. The compassion in his manuscript did not come from solitary reflection alone. It came from witnessing the humanity of other knights laid bare in the soft glow of hidden fires. The manuscript's coded symbols, once mysterious, began to make sense in this context. Some represented stages of inner struggle. Others marked the presence of teachings whispered only among the hidden brotherhood. These symbols were not meant to conceal secrets from the world, but to preserve fragile truths meant only for those who needed them. The unnamed Templar later wrote one line that scholars often cite when discussing this secret inner circle. The strongest bond among us was never forged by steel, but by the courage to speak honestly in the quiet. This hidden brotherhood was not made of elites or mystics. It was made of ordinary knights who carried extraordinary burdens. Men who feared being seen as weak yet discovered that shared struggle created a strength deeper than discipline. Men who learned that honesty could rebuild a shattered spirit faster than any victory in battle. And though history has forgotten their names, their influence lived on through the manuscript, through every insight, every line of compassion. Every symbol that reflected struggle transformed into wisdom. The hidden brotherhood may never appear in official histories, but their presence shaped the voice that would one day speak through centuries. In their vulnerability, the unnamed Templar found the humanity he needed to craft teachings powerful enough to outlive fire, betrayal, and time itself. Europe at the time of the Templars' downfall was not a calm or orderly world. It was a continent trembling under the weight of uncertainty. A world where kings feared bankruptcy more than enemies, where peasants feared famine more than war, and where the church feared losing its influence more than anything else. Every corner of Europe seemed to be fraying, slowly, quietly, like threads coming loose from an old tapestry. And into this unstable world, the Templars marched with the same confidence they had carried for 2 centuries, unaware that history was shifting beneath their feet. The unnamed Templar would later write that the years before the order's fall felt like the calm before a storm. Not an obvious storm, but the kind that gathers slowly, silently, until the sky is too heavy to ignore. Political tensions thickened the air. Rumors traveled faster than caravans. Whispers of alliances and betrayals drifted through royal courts like cold drafts. Something dangerous was building, but no one could see it clearly yet. France, the center of much of this tension, was drowning in debts. King Philip IV had emptied his treasury on wars, luxuries, and political maneuvering. His desperation sharpened his ambition, turning it into something ruthless. Europe watched as he taxed peasants mercilessly, confiscated wealth from Jewish communities, and even challenged the Pope himself in a clash of wills that shook Christendom. Philip's hunger for gold was insatiable, and the Templars, with their vast properties, global banking network, and vaults filled with donations, were an irresistible target. But it wasn't just about money. Power was shifting. The Templars, once hailed as holy warriors, had become inconvenient. Their influence in trade, politics, and finance made kings uneasy. Their independence made the church uneasy. Their secrecy made everyone uneasy. What people cannot understand, they often fear. And what rulers fear, they often destroy. At the same time, Europe faced spiritual unrest. The Crusades had ended in bitter disappointment. Jerusalem was lost. Countless lives had been spent with little to show in return. Ordinary people began questioning why so much blood had been spilled. Priests struggled to reassure them. Soldiers returned home haunted and disillusioned. Merchants found safer, easier routes for trade that did not require holy wars. The Templars, once symbols of divine purpose, now seemed like relics of a war-torn age that Europe wanted to forget. The unnamed Templar sensed this shift even before his arrest. He wrote that the world felt thin, as if the structures holding everything together were weakening. He described watching crowds in markets, noticing how people talked less of pilgrims and more of taxes, how hope felt less like a flame and more like a fragile ember. He saw how even devout men seemed tired of crusades, how faith was shifting from the sword to the coin. He also sensed a growing suspicion, not directed at him personally, but at the order as a whole. Townspeople whispered when nights passed. Some wondered aloud how a monastic order had become one of the wealthiest institutions in Europe. Others speculated absurd tales. Secret rituals, hidden treasures, strange ceremonies. Such rumors were nothing new, but in a world on edge, rumors metastasized into fear. and fear is the easiest weapon for a desperate king to wield. But Europe's instability went deeper than economics and politics. Nature itself contributed to the tension. Crops failed in certain regions. Winters grew harsher. Plagues killed livestock. People began searching for someone to blame, and powerful institutions always make convenient targets. If kings suffered misfortune, they blamed the bankers. If the church faced criticism, it blamed the heretics. And in those volatile years, the Templars were painted as both. This shift was subtle at first. A strange look exchanged in the marketplace. A priest's sermon that seemed unusually cold. A traveler's tale about strange accusations uttered in distant towns. The unnamed Templar wrote about walking through a village where children used to greet the knights with excitement. But now eyes narrowed and mothers pulled them aside. He sensed something was cracking between the order and the people it once protected. Europe was a continent ready for a scapegoat. All it needed was someone powerful enough to point the finger. King Philip IV did exactly that. He weaponized Europe's unrest, claiming that the Templars, the once holy warriors, had grown corrupt, heretical, dangerous. He spun lies into accusations, accusations into confessions, and confessions into tragedy. The people, weary from hunger, taxes, and uncertainty, accepted the narrative because it offered a simple explanation for their suffering. It is easier to blame a symbol than to confront complex truth. And so, the world that had once raised the Templars to glory now turned its gaze away, indifferent or even eager to see them fall. The unnamed Templar watched this happen in slow motion. He saw the political gears turning. He saw the public sentiment shifting. He saw the church straining under pressure. And yet, he believed, like many of his brothers, that truth and righteousness would protect them. He would later write, with bitter clarity, "We did not fear the enemy on horseback. We feared not the arrow nor the blade. But we never imagined that our downfall would come from the very world we vowed to serve." Europe was not collapsing. It was transforming. And in that transformation, the Templars became casualties of a new age. An age ruled not by faith, but by fear, gold, and power. The unnamed Templar did not yet know how catastrophic this shift would be. But the first cracks in the foundation of their world were already spreading. Cracks that would soon erupt into betrayal, fire, and the desperate creation of the manuscript that would outlive them all. He was a king draped in velvet, crowned in gold, yet haunted like a man being followed by his own shadow. Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, was known for his beauty, his regal posture, and his calm expression. But beneath that stillness lay a mind endlessly calculating, endlessly fearful, endlessly hungry for control. He ruled not with wisdom, but with anxiety disguised as authority. And in his fear he saw ghosts, ghosts of debts, ghosts of enemies, ghosts of powers greater than his throne. The unnamed Templar would later write of Philip with a tone that was not hatred, but mournful clarity. The king, he wrote, was a man who feared what he could not command. It was a dangerous flaw for someone who held the fate of nations in his hands. For Philip, the Templars represented everything he could not fully grasp or manipulate. They were respected by the church yet not controlled by it. They were wealthy yet not owned by the crown. They were warriors yet answered to no king. They were disciplined, devout, and united by a loyalty that no amount of royal pressure could bend. To a king obsessed with control, that was enough to spark terror. Philip's fear did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, like a storm forming beyond the horizon. His financial troubles gnawed at him daily. Wars had emptied his treasury. Failed diplomacy had weakened his authority. Even his appearance of calm superiority hid a constant internal panic, a dread of losing everything he believed he deserved. But pride would not allow him to appear weak. Instead, he convinced himself that the reason for his struggles lay not within his own mismanagement, but in the supposed threats surrounding him. And so he looked outward, for enemies, for excuses, for ghosts to blame. The Templars were an easy target. They held the wealth he needed, the influence he envied, and the loyalty he could never command. They were admired by the people more than the crown was. Their vows made them answers to God, not to kings. and that alone made Philip feel small. Not powerless, small. A man who demands absolute obedience cannot tolerate institutions that operate independently through faith and honor. But Philip's fear ran deeper than political insecurity. He was a superstitious man, prone to reading omens into the smallest misfortune. A storm ruining a royal feast, a failed negotiation, collapsing bridge. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs or imagined them. He consulted astrologers, mystics, and advisors who fed his paranoia because it pleased the king to believe that mystical forces were at play around him. Whispered rumors reached him. Tales claiming the Templars possessed secret knowledge, hidden rituals, ancient relics. None of these rumors were grounded in truth, but Philip did not need truth. He needed justification, and superstition painted the Templars as an invisible threat. He began to see the Templar Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, not as a holy knight, but as a rival presence too powerful to control. De Molay was respected across Europe, widely seen as a man of integrity, a warrior monk whose loyalty to God was unshakable. To Philip, that integrity was threatening. A man who cannot be corrupted is a man who cannot be controlled. As Philip's fear deepened, so did his desperation. His debts had grown monstrous. His reputation faltered. The papacy had moved to France, where he exerted influence, yet even that did not calm his restless insecurities. He saw enemies in every corner. He saw danger in institutions that did not bow to him. And he saw the Templars as a mirror reflecting everything he feared he could never be: honorable, disciplined, respected. Fear twisted into resentment. Resentment twisted into hatred. Hatred twisted into plotting. The unnamed Templar wrote that fear in a king spreads faster than flame in dry grass. It infects his ministers, his soldiers, his courtroom. Soon, those around Philip echoed his paranoia, not because they believed it, but because disagreeing with him was dangerous. The king, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, spiraled deeper into his own fantasies of threat until they felt like absolute truth. And then came the most chilling detail: the royal decree that any written records belonging to the Templars were to be confiscated and reviewed before interrogation even began. But within that decree was a secret instruction, whispered only among Philip's closest agents. Burn the writings that are too loyal, too spiritual, too inspiring. He did not fear their so-called heresy. He feared their influence. He feared their unity. He feared the courage in their stories and the strength in their teachings. He feared the example they set, that a man could be loyal to something greater than a throne. But fear is a poor advisor, and it pushed him into decisions that would echo through history. His arrest orders were prepared in silence. His accusations were invented, crafted from whispers and lies. Torture would ensure confessions. Execution would ensure obedience. The unnamed Templar later reflected on this with heart-wrenching insight. It was not our swords that frightened him. It was our faith. For a king who trusts nothing, faith in anything becomes a threat. And so, Philip, the king who feared ghosts, set into motion a purge that would stain Europe for generations. A purge created by paranoia, fueled by greed, and justified by lies. What he did not realize was that destroying an order built on honor does not silence it. It amplifies it. It turns a fallen brotherhood into a legend. And legends have a way of rising from ashes to speak truths kings cannot silence. Truths that would one day reach even those far beyond Philip's world, carried by a manuscript he tried so desperately to erase. The cells were never meant to hold men like them. They were built for thieves, drunkards, and the desperate poor, not for warriors who had marched through deserts, defended kingdoms, and bled for Christendom. Yet here they were, stripped of their mantles, bound in chains, pushed into cramped stone chambers where even the air felt like it had been forgotten by God. The walls sweated with dampness. The floors were uneven. The darkness seemed to thicken with each passing hour. What the Templars endured in captivity was not simply imprisonment. It was a methodical breaking of the human spirit. King Philip's men knew that the order would never fall by force of arms. They had faced armies without flinching. They had survived sieges, starved through winters, and faced death with unwavering calm. To destroy men like that, one had to wage a war of the mind. And so, torture became the weapon of choice. The unnamed Templar wrote of those days with a detachment that was almost frightening, as though the pain had happened to someone else. But the details he recorded revealed a horror that no armor or training could prepare a man for. The interrogators did not begin with violence. They began with silence. Long, stretching hours of isolation broken only by the scrape of iron hinges and the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark. They let fear grow like mold in the cracks of the cell. They knew that the anticipation of suffering often wounds deeper than the suffering itself. Then came the accusations. Blasphemy, idolatry, corruption, heresy. Words twisted with venom, repeated until the walls themselves seemed to echo them. The knights refuted the charges with calm certainty at first, confident that truth would shield them. But truth means nothing to men who seek confessions, not justice. When the refusals continued, the torment began. The unnamed Templar described hearing the crack of whips in the neighboring cell before he ever felt one himself. He heard the strained, trembling cries of brothers he had marched beside, men he had believed unbreakable. Hearing them made his stomach twist in ways he had never known on a battlefield. Pain inflicted by an enemy is one thing. Hearing your own brother suffer is another, far deeper wound. He wrote of the rack, the stretching of limbs until joints screamed. He wrote of the boots filled with heated irons, the crushing pressure against ankles that left bones splintered. He described the blows to the stomach meant to leave no visible bruises but to cause internal agony. He told of water forced into lungs until the body convulsed in panic, a crude, early version of drowning without death. Some broke. They had to. No mortal man could withstand endless torment without faltering. Under unimaginable agony, knights confessed to sins they had never committed. They repeated whatever the interrogators demanded, desperate for the pain to stop. But the unnamed Templar did not judge those who yielded. He wrote with compassion, not condemnation. Pain is a sword that cuts through the lies we tell ourselves about our limits. He understood that even the strongest men have breaking points. Torture did not reveal truth, it only revealed suffering. What struck him more profoundly than the violence was the silence that followed it. After a brother screamed, confessed, or fainted, a heavy quietness would fall over the cells. It was not peace. It was resignation. The echoing emptiness left behind when a man realizes that strength, faith, and discipline cannot protect him from cruelty. Yet there were moments, small but luminous, when the spirit of the order refused to die. In the deepest hours of the night, when the guards slept or drank in the hallway, the Templars whispered between their cells. They whispered prayers. They whispered reminders that they were brothers. They whispered words of comfort that carried more power than any sword ever could. The unnamed Templar cherished those whispers. He said they felt like a hand reaching through the darkness, steadying him when he felt himself beginning to fracture. He wrote that suffering shared becomes lighter, even if only by a fraction. But not all whispers were of comfort. Some brothers, half-conscious and delirious from pain, murmured doubts that they had carried secretly for years. Others recited half-remembered prayers, clinging to fragments of faith. A few begged for God to take them rather than face another day. The walls heard everything and kept everything. Despite the agony, something remarkable happened. Many knights refused to betray the order. Even as their bodies failed them, their spirits clung to loyalty. Some died under torture without uttering a single false confession. Their silence, the unnamed Templar wrote, was the last act of courage they had left to give. He remembered one brother in particular, a quiet man who had rarely spoken during their campaigns. Under torture, he refused every accusation. He endured broken bones, burns, and days without water. At last, the interrogators left him for dead on the floor of his cell. Before dawn, the unnamed Templar heard him whisper a single phrase, "God is watching." It was not triumph. It was not defiance. It was a reminder, a fragile thread of faith held between two dying men. As days blurred into weeks, the unnamed Templar felt something inside him shift. He did not break as others did, But neither did he remain whole. Instead, he transformed. The pain carved away his illusions. The suffering hollowed him out, not into emptiness, but into clarity. He began to see his brothers not as warriors, but as human beings carrying scars deeper than battle wounds. It was during captivity that he realized the Order's true strength had never been its swords, its wealth, or its influence. Its strength was the quiet resilience of ordinary men who refused to surrender their integrity even when stripped of everything else. And it was in that darkness, surrounded by chains and despair, that the teachings he would later write began to solidify. Not as ideas, but as truths carved into his very flesh. He learned that suffering tests faith but does not define it. That courage is not loud, but steady. That loyalty survives even where freedom does not. And that the human spirit, though fragile, can carry light even in the deepest night. These realizations, born in chains, forged in agony, became the heartbeat of the manuscript he would later create. A manuscript that would outlive torture, outlive kings, and outlive the Order itself. The guards believed the darkness would weaken them. They believed that silence, isolation, and the cold dampness of the stone would chip away at the Templars' resolve. And for many, it did. The days blended into nights until time itself felt like a cruel, unbroken line. The air was stale. The straw bedding rotted. Rats skittered across the floor, sometimes bold enough to crawl over the prisoners' legs as they drifted into exhausted sleep. But amid that crushing gloom, one small, impossible miracle happened. A candle appeared. It arrived not with fanfare, not with the clang of keys or the footsteps of a sympathetic guard. It arrived as quietly as hope often does. A single flicker of light that should not have been there. The unnamed Templar never revealed who brought it. Some believe it was a guard bribed by a monk. Some think a brother in another cell passed it through a crack in the wall. Others argue that a priest, ashamed of the lies surrounding the arrests, smuggled it in as an act of penance. The truth, like the candle's origin, remains hidden. All the manuscript says is this: one night, light found its way into my cell. He described the moment with such vivid tenderness that centuries later, readers still feel the weight of it. He had been lying on the cold stone floor, muscles trembling from interrogation, wrists raw from chains. His breath had grown shallow. His thoughts had begun to scatter into fragments. Memories of desert marches, of kneeling in prayer, of voices from his brothers whispering through the darkness. He felt as though he were drifting away from himself. Then, a glow touched the floor. Soft, warm, unmistakably real. He forced his eyes open and saw it. A candle, no longer than a finger, burning weakly but bravely, its flame shivering as though afraid of the dark pressing in on it. He crawled toward it, every movement a stab of pain, and cupped his hands around it as if shielding a newborn life. The warmth against his palms felt almost foreign, like a forgotten language returning suddenly to memory. In that fragile light, he saw the walls of his cell for the first time in weeks. The scratches on the stone, the dried blood stains, the rough lines marking days he had lost count of. But he also saw something else: possibility. Light did not change the prison, changed him, pulled him back from the edge of despair. He wrote later, "The candle did not burn away the darkness. It reminded me that darkness was not all there was." For the first time in days, his mind steadied. His breath slowed. His heart, which had felt strangled by fear and exhaustion, beat with a renewed softness. He sat with the candle cupped in his hands like a sacred relic, though it was nothing more than melted wax shaped roughly by fingers that must have trembled while making it. In that moment of reprieve, he did something unexpected. He prayed. Not the formal, structured prayers of the Order. Not the rehearsed chants spoken in unison during morning rituals. He prayed like a man stripped of rank, stripped of purpose, stripped of every illusion he once held. He prayed to be guided, not saved, guided, to be shown how to endure what he could no longer understand. And after he prayed, he did something even more remarkable. He wrote. Someone, perhaps the same mysterious ally who brought the candle, had hidden a fragment of parchment beneath the loose stone near his bed of straw. It was small, rough, and badly creased, but it was enough. A sliver of charcoal had been tucked beside it. The unnamed Templar recognized immediately that this gift was not meant for record-keeping or confession. It was meant for meaning. He pressed the charcoal to the parchment, the candlelight trembling beside his hand, and wrote the first lines of what would one day become part of the manuscript. When life breaks you down, rise quietly. Rise slowly. Rise as the dawn rises, not in power, but in persistence. His hands shook as he wrote, not from weakness, but from the emotional weight of seeing words spill onto a page again. Words that had lived inside him in fragments now flowed with surprising clarity. The cell did not vanish. The pain did not disappear, but something inside him shifted, something subtle yet profound. He realized he was still capable of giving, still capable of creating, still capable of reaching beyond the chains. The candle burned steadily, as if fueled by his resolve rather than the thin wick. He wrote until the flame dimmed. He wrote until the charcoal snapped. He wrote until he felt something within himself reawaken. And when the light finally died, plunging the cell back into suffocating darkness, he felt strangely unafraid. The darkness was no longer the enemy. It was merely the space around the light he now carried inside himself. He tucked the parchment beneath his thin cloak and closed his eyes. The damp stone no longer felt as cold. The chains no longer felt as heavy. In the silence, he heard whispers from neighboring cells. Soft, weary voices praying, murmuring, surviving. He spoke to them through the wall. "We are not done. Not yet." The candle had not saved his life, but it had saved his spirit. And from that night forward, he understood something essential. Even a single flicker of hope can anchor a man through the darkest hours of his existence. Those words, written by the light of a forbidden flame, would one day ignite a message powerful enough to cross centuries, teaching others that no matter how deep the darkness, one small spark can change everything. They tried to erase everything. Every scroll, every ledger, every teaching, every record the Templars had preserved over 2 centuries. Seized, confiscated, piled into heaps, and fed to flames that roared like beasts tasting blood for the first time. The king's agents swept through commanderies with ruthless efficiency, following Philip IV's hidden instruction. Destroy their words before you break their bodies. Yet somehow, impossibly, the manuscript survived. Not intact, not unscarred, but alive, like a wounded soldier crawling from the battlefield long after the last arrow has fallen. The unnamed Templar would later write that words have a way of escaping where men cannot, and history proved him right. The mystery of how the manuscript slipped through the tightening grip of royal agents has fueled centuries of speculation. Scholars have proposed theories, each more intriguing than the last, yet none conclusive. The truth remains hidden behind the smoke of burned archives and the silence of those who risked everything to preserve a single voice. One theory focuses on the Templar scribes, men who spent their lives bending over desks, copying sacred texts with unwavering precision. These scribes were devoted, clever, and intimately familiar with the order's hidden passages, secret compartments, and coded storage systems. Some believe a scribe discovered the manuscript shortly after the arrests began and, recognizing its spiritual value rather than its political importance, hid it before agents could confiscate it. There were rumors among medieval chroniclers of ghost scrolls that reappeared in monasteries years after the purge. Documents believed destroyed, but somehow preserved by monks who sympathized with the Templars. The unnamed Templar's manuscript may have been one such text, rescued in pieces and copied discreetly by a monk who refused to allow its voice to be silenced. Another theory suggests the manuscript was smuggled out of the prison itself. Guards were not all loyal to Philip's cause. Many were simply men earning wages, torn between duty and a quiet sense of justice. Some had seen the Templars protect pilgrims on the roads, defend towns in times of war, and offer charity to the poor. It is believed that one such guard, a man conflicted by what he witnessed, retrieved the parchment from the unnamed Templar's cell after one of the interrogations, keeping it hidden beneath his clothing before passing it to someone he trusted. But the most compelling theory involves the Templar network itself. Contrary to royal propaganda, The order was not a rigid monolith easily crushed. It was a web of loyalties stretching across Europe: knights, sergeants, scribes, lay brothers, chaplains, and associates who owed nothing to France or its king. Even as the arrests spread, messages and warnings traveled silently across borders by couriers loyal to the order. Some believe one such courier, learning of the Templars' writings, retrieved the manuscript from Paris and carried it to a distant safehouse, perhaps in Scotland, Portugal, or the remote mountains of Aragon, all regions known for sheltering Templar survivors. Whatever the truth, the manuscript bears physical scars that testify to its perilous journey. Scorch marks along the edges, as if it had once been close enough to fire to blister but not burn. Water stains along the corners, perhaps from a river crossing, or from tears shed by someone who understood its value. Small punctures in the parchment, maybe from being wrapped in cloth and secured with a pin. The unnamed Templar wrote of his final days in captivity, unaware that his words would escape. He believed they would perish with him, swallowed by flames or rotting in some forgotten corner of a prison archive. But men acting in the shadows, monks, brothers, sympathizers, chose differently. They chose to preserve something that felt larger than one life, larger than the order itself. There is an old legend that on the night after Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake, a monk fleeing Paris carried under his cloak a small bundle wrapped in linen. He slipped across the Seine in a small boat, avoiding patrols, clutching the package as if it were a newborn child. When asked what compelled him to risk his life, he allegedly answered, "Some words are meant to live. Even kings cannot stop them." Whether myth or truth, the manuscript's survival defied every intention of its enemies. Philip IV tried to erase not only the order but their memory, their teachings, their stories. He believed that destroying their archives would destroy their legacy. He failed, because words, real words, honest words, words born from suffering and shaped by the deepest parts of the human spirit, cannot be fully destroyed. They burrow into time the way seeds bury into earth, waiting patiently for the right moment to rise. Centuries later, when the manuscript was unearthed, scholars marveled less at its content and more at the fact that it existed at all. A text written in chains, hidden in fear, smuggled through danger, preserved in silence. A document that should never have survived long enough to be read by anyone outside a prison cell. And yet it endured. Its survival became part of its power. Its voice became part of its mystery. The unnamed Templars' writings escaped the fire not because fate protected them, but because human hands, trembling, determined, and fiercely loyal, chose to save them. In that act of defiance, in that quiet courage, the message was carried forward. Even when an empire tries to silence truth, there will always be someone who carries it. In secret, in shadow, in hope. The manuscript lived on. And because it lived, so did the voice that would one day speak across centuries to those who needed it most. The manuscript did not read like something written in the 14th century. Its words, though born in a prison cell, carried a strange timelessness. The kind that makes a reader pause, breathe slower, and wonder how a man separated by 7 centuries could understand them so intimately. Scholars who examined it centuries later were baffled by the tone. The phrasing was old, yet the emotion was startlingly modern. The reflections echoed the psychological insights of thinkers who would not be born for hundreds of years. It was as if the Templar wrote with one foot in his own age and one foot far beyond it. The unnamed Templar never intended to write a philosophical treatise. He was not a scholar or theologian. He did not write like a priest trying to instruct, nor like a soldier recording logistics. His words felt like whispers spoken from experience rather than authority. What made them powerful was not structure, but sincerity. The manuscript spoke less about the external world and more about the unseen landscape inside each human being. Fear, hope, doubt, endurance, grief, faith. This gave it a rare quality. Readers across centuries felt the manuscript was speaking to them, not at them. He wrote in simple metaphors. He used images from nature, from battle, from prayer, from daily struggle. He compared resilience to the slow rising of dawn, to the quiet persistence of roots beneath sand, to the steady breathing of a horse after a long journey. He wrote that human beings are like fortresses built not of stone, but of moments endured. He wrote that despair is the desert at night, overwhelming until the first light cracks the horizon. These phrases showed extraordinary psychological awareness that modern scholars often attribute to trauma survivors. The unnamed Templar seemed to understand, instinctively, the rhythms of human suffering. He knew that grief comes in waves, that fear grows in silence, that healing happens slowly and often invisibly. He knew that people need not grand speeches, but reminders that life continues in small ways even when everything feels broken. His words showed an understanding of perseverance that resonated deeply with later generations. Strength is not a gift. It is a craft learned slowly, painfully, again and again. This line, simple yet profound, would appear in dozens of later commentaries and translations. It struck scholars as astonishingly close to modern psychological concepts, the idea that resilience is not innate but developed through struggle. But what intrigued scholars most was the emotional intelligence in his writing. He understood guilt as something that clings like wet cloth, heavy and cold, yet liftable if shared. He understood fear as the shadow cast by a future imagined but not yet lived. He understood hopelessness as a kind of blindness, not to the world itself, but to one's own strength. These insights were not typical of medieval texts. They bore resemblance not to theological works, but to journals, confessions, and reflective writings produced by modern individuals facing loss or trauma. The manuscript revealed a man who observed not only events, but the inner tremors they caused. Even more, the Templar's reflections carried surprising gentleness. He had survived battles, storms, deserts, and torture, yet he wrote with softness, as though addressing someone fragile, someone who needed reassurance. He did not write like a warrior to warriors. He wrote like a wounded man speaking to another wounded soul across time. He acknowledged brokenness without shame. He acknowledged uncertainty without guilt. He acknowledged suffering without bitterness. In an age where knights were expected to be stoic, unyielding symbols of strength, his words felt astonishingly human. One passage struck scholars as almost prophetic. A man is not healed by time, but by truth, the truth he faces, and the truth he learns to accept. This sounded more like a modern understanding of healing than a medieval one. It suggested introspection, emotional honesty, and self-awareness, qualities rarely emphasized in medieval warrior culture. Another reason scholars found the manuscript uncanny was the way it reframed faith. Instead of presenting God as a force of absolute certainty, the Templar described faith as a lantern carried through storms, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, but always carried. This contrasted sharply with the rigid doctrines of his time. His faith was not unwavering. It flickered, it faltered, it trembled, but it endured, and that nuance made his voice feel startlingly contemporary. He wrote openly about doubt, not as sin, but as the natural companion of belief. He described moments when prayer felt like speaking into a void. He admitted that silence frightened him. He confessed that suffering made him question his purpose. And yet, he always returned to hope, not because certainty had returned, but because he chose hope deliberately. That voluntary return to hope, that decision rather than feeling, resonated with generations of readers. Scholars studying trauma would later write about the manuscript in academic journals, calling it a medieval example of cognitive resilience, an emotional map of survival, and a text centuries ahead of its time in psychological insight. But to the unnamed Templar, it was simply truth. Truth he had learned the hard way. Truth he believed someone else needed to hear. Perhaps the most haunting quality of the manuscript is how directly it speaks to the reader. He wrote phrases like, "You who read this, know that your pain is not the end. You who fear the dark, know that dawn comes whether you see it or not. You who have fallen, know that standing again is enough." These are not medieval exhortations. They are timeless consolations, universal, intimate, and profoundly comforting. It was as if the Templar knew he was writing for a world beyond his own. as if he sensed that his words would be carried across centuries to someone who needed them, someone facing their own battles, their own prisons, their own deserts. This mysterious sense of timelessness gave rise to the section's theme, the voice through time. In the end, scholars agreed on one thing: the manuscript survives not because it is historical, but because it is human. It speaks the language of struggle, healing, and hope, a language that never changes, regardless of the century. The unnamed Templar did not write for his age. He wrote for every age that would come after. And that, more than anything, is why his voice still feels alive, whispering across centuries, waiting to reach whoever needs it next. The manuscript symbols, scattered like constellations across its margins, had puzzled readers for generations. They were not random decorations. They were deliberate, carefully placed, almost ritualistic in their repetition. To understand the manuscript fully, scholars knew they had to decipher these marks, but decoding them revealed something far deeper than secret writing. It revealed a hidden dimension of the Templar mind, a quiet inner world built not of swords and strategy, but of reflection, discipline, and spiritual endurance. For the unnamed Templar, these symbols were not meant to obscure meaning. They were meant to protect it. He knew his experiences were too personal, too vulnerable, too spiritually dangerous to expose plainly on parchment that could fall into hostile hands. So he wrapped his truths in simple shapes that only those familiar with the order's inner contemplative practices could decipher. The first recurring symbol was the diagonal line intersected by 3 short horizontal strokes, the one scholars later nicknamed the Mark of Rising. It appeared in the margins beside passages about despair, recovery, or inner transformation. The Templar never explained it directly, but its placement revealed its meaning. It resembled a ladder, incomplete, imperfect, encouraging ascent without demanding perfection. To those who understood the hidden brotherhood, the symbol represented the act of standing back up. Not triumph, not victory, the simple, stubborn decision to rise after a fall. It was a reminder that resilience is not a single moment, but a repeated choice. The unnamed Templar placed this symbol beside lines that spoke of brokenness, loss, and the slow rebuilding of hope, as if to say, here, this is where you rise. Another mark appeared less frequently, the small spiral with a dot at its center. Scholars debated its meaning endlessly. Some said it symbolized contemplation. Others believed it represented the inward turn of the spirit. In Templar lore, spirals often indicated a movement toward inner truth. The dot at the center suggested a point of stillness, the quiet within chaos. Whenever the Templar placed this symbol, the text beside it shifted into a deeper tone. He wrote about silence, about listening for God not in thunder or triumph, but in the fragile space between breaths. He described the human soul as a spiral journey, moving outward into action, inward into reflection, outward again into the world. The symbol became a map of introspection, marking the passages where he wrestled with doubt, fear, and the search for clarity. The third symbol was the simplest, a single horizontal line. It appeared beside passages where the Templar spoke of acceptance, not surrender, but the calm acknowledgement of reality. In the hidden brotherhood, this line marked the practice of stillness, grounding oneself before chaos. It represented the horizon, a reminder that even when storms rage, there is a line where sky meets earth, steady and unbroken. These symbols were not secret codes meant to hide scandal or doctrine. They were cues, anchors, quiet companions for those who read the text centuries later. Through them, the Templar was teaching without preaching, guiding without forcing, whispering through signs instead of sermons. But the manuscript held one more symbol, the rarest, the most enigmatic. It appeared only twice, a circle broken at the bottom, as if someone had drawn it and then hesitated to close it. Scholars called it the broken halo. This symbol appeared next to the manuscript's most vulnerable confessions. Moments when the Templar admitted to feeling abandoned by God, moments when he questioned his faith, moments when he felt unworthy of redemption. Medieval religious texts almost never acknowledged such honesty. To doubt was considered dangerous. To admit doubt was nearly unthinkable. Yet he marked those moments not with shame, but with this strange broken circle. To him, it represented a truth he could not voice openly. Holiness is not perfection. Holiness is the willingness to continue seeking even when faith cracks. The broken halo was a reminder that spiritual strength includes imperfection, that sometimes the path to God passes through places where light cannot easily reach. These coded symbols, taken together, formed a gentle framework of spiritual practice, one entirely separate from the military and religious duties of the order. They hinted at a quiet Templar tradition, one that blended discipline with contemplation, prayer with listening, strength with softness. It was a hidden lineage of inner work passed not through official teachings, but through experience. The unnamed Templar described one of these practices briefly in the manuscript, a ritual of stillness performed among brothers who trusted one another deeply. It did not involve chants or relics. It involved breathing. The knights would sit in a circle, remove their armor, rest their hands on their knees, and breathe slowly until their thoughts settled. They believed stillness sharpened clarity, and clarity strengthened courage. In these moments, one brother would sometimes share a lesson or reflection. They called these quiet teachings. Many of the manuscript's most powerful insights echoed these private exchanges. The idea that strength grows through vulnerability, that courage walks hand in hand with fear, that endurance is a skill honed through suffering, not an innate gift. The coded symbols marked where those quiet teachings lived in the text, preserving them for future generations of seekers. For modern readers, decoding the manuscript felt like peering through a keyhole into the inner life of a medieval warrior monk. A life far more introspective, far more compassionate, far more complex than history often portrays. It revealed an inner world where discipline coexisted with doubt, where suffering became a teacher, where silence held answers louder than battle cries. In the end, scholars realized the symbols were not meant to hide the truth. They were meant to highlight it. They were signposts for the careful reader, guiding them through the Templars' inner transformation. Every mark, every line, spiral, and broken circle was a whisper from the past saying, "Pay attention, this moment matters. This is where the soul changes." Through these quiet codes, the unnamed Templar ensured that his teachings would survive not just as history, but as living wisdom, wisdom that continues to speak to anyone navigating darkness, seeking clarity, or learning, slowly and painfully, how to rise again. The night of the execution did not arrive suddenly. It approached like a slow-moving tide, heavy and inevitable. Paris had grown strangely quiet in the days leading up to it, as if the city itself understood that something monumental, something irreversible, was about to unfold. The air hung with an unnerving stillness, broken only by the distant murmur of crowds gathering along the Seine. Word had spread quickly. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, would be executed at sunset. And with him, the last embers of the order would be smothered beneath the weight of royal fear. The unnamed Templar, though imprisoned elsewhere, later wrote about that night with a sorrow so profound it bled through every line of his manuscript. He had not witnessed the execution with his eyes, but with his soul. He felt it in the stone walls, in the tremors of distant voices, in the way the guards avoided glancing into the cells. Something in the world was shifting, something sacred being extinguished. As dusk painted the river in strokes of gold and crimson, the king's soldiers led de Molay and another high-ranking brother, Geoffroy de Charny, to the small island known as the Isle aux Juifs. The crowd pressed tightly against the riverbanks, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and somber respect. These were not ordinary criminals being marched to their deaths. They were legends, reduced to prisoners by the machinations of a desperate king. The pyre had been built tall, deliberately so. Flames would be visible from the far side of the river. Philip IV wanted a spectacle, a warning. But what he did not understand was that some men burn differently. De Molay walked with dignity, even as chains clinked around his wrists. Witnesses later recorded that his back remained straight, his expression calm, as though he were attending a ceremony rather than his own execution. He wore no mantle now, no armor, no cross. Yet he carried an authority that no fire could diminish, the authority of a man who knew his truth, even as lies swirled around him like smoke. The executioners bound him to the stake, piling wood around his feet. As the torches approached, the unnamed Templar wrote that he imagined the scene with haunting clarity. The flicker of flames against de Molay's face, the crackling hiss of pitch-soaked branches, the wind tugging at the edges of the fire as though trying to delay the inevitable. And then the flames rose. They licked the wood, then climbed upward, hungry and bright. Smoke curled into the air, drifting over the river. The crowd gasped as fire consumed the base of the pyre, but what happened next would echo through centuries. De Molay did not scream. He did not beg. He did not confess. Instead, he spoke. His voice, carried by wind and fire, rang clearly across the Seine. Chroniclers wrote that his final words sounded like both a prayer and a prophecy, a declaration that those who had condemned the order would face divine judgment. Some claimed he called upon God to judge Pope Clement and King Philip within a year. Others said he merely stated that truth, though buried by fire, cannot be extinguished. The unnamed Templar wrote that he felt those words reverberate through the stones of his cell, not as a curse, but as a final act of courage. A man may lose his life, but not his integrity. The flames rose higher, engulfing de Molay completely. His silhouette wavered, then blurred, then dissolved into the blaze. The crowd fell silent. Some crossed themselves. Others turned away, unable to watch the martyrdom of a man who had once been the most powerful knight in Christendom. But the fire did not only consume a man. It consumed centuries of legacy, sacrifice, and belief. The order that had stood as a symbol of faith and strength was being erased in front of an audience who knew they were witnessing the end of an era. In his cell, the unnamed Templar felt something inside him shatter. He closed his eyes, imagining the smoke rising into the evening sky, carrying with it every vow he had ever sworn. He whispered de Molay's name like a prayer. He whispered the names of brothers lost to torture, brothers lost to despair, brothers lost to betrayal. He whispered until his voice trembled. But as grief washed over him, something else surfaced. Something quiet, steady, and unbroken. The manuscript reveals that this moment marked a turning point. The Templar realized that while the order's physical presence could be destroyed, its principles could not. Fire could consume flesh, wood, and parchment, but not loyalty, not courage, not wisdom forged in suffering. By candlelight, he wrote the words that appear in a trembling hand in the middle of the manuscript. When fire takes everything, it reveals what cannot be taken. Those words were not written for history. They were written for survival, his, and for anyone who would one day face their own flames, whether literal or metaphorical. Outside, as the fire died to embers, the river carried its smoke into the night sky. People dispersed in silence, haunted by the image of a man who refused to bow even as flames embraced him. Within the prison, the unnamed Templar felt the warmth of that distant fire in his chest, a warmth that did not burn, but illuminated. He understood that de Molay's final act was not destruction. It was transformation. The night the Grand Master burned was the night the order ceased to exist in the world of kings and laws, and the night it began to live in the realm of memory, legend, and spiritual endurance. A new fire had been lit, not on a pyre, but in the heart of a man writing in darkness. A fire that would carry his voice through time, outlasting the king, outlasting the flames, outlasting the very world that tried to silence him. The morning after the flames died, Paris woke to an unsettling hush. It was not the peaceful quiet of a city at rest. It was the silence that settles after something sacred has been broken. The air still carried the faint scent of smoke drifting from the Isle aux Juifs, where embers smoldered beneath a gray sky. People moved through the streets with lowered voices, as though afraid their words might disturb the lingering spirit of what had happened. The unnamed Templar, locked in his cell, felt the shift before he heard it. Cities have moods, he wrote, and that morning, Paris felt hollow, like a cathedral after its candles have burned out. Something had been ripped from the world, and the void it left behind seemed to echo through every stone, every alley, every breath. Europe did not collapse that night, but it changed, in a way that even kings could not fully control. De Molay's execution was meant to be a final blow, a decisive end to the Knights Templar, an erasure not just of their lives, but of their memory. Philip IV believed that fear would settle like ash across the continent, silencing anyone who dared sympathize with the fallen order. Instead, something unexpected happened. Whispers grew. Not defiant, not rebellious, but mournful, haunted, compelled to ask questions kings preferred buried. Travelers carried the story across borders. Merchants repeated it in taverns. Pilgrims murmured it in church courtyards. In distant villages, where no Templar had ever set foot, people still heard of the knight who burned without breaking, who defied a king with his final breath. In Paris, some claimed that de Molay's voice lingered in the smoke above the river long after his body was gone. Others swore that the sky dimmed strangely during the execution, as if recoiling from the injustice. And when, months later, both Pope Clement and King Philip died under unusual, sudden circumstances, many whispered that the Grand Master's prophecy had come true. The unnamed Templar wrote of these rumors with caution, yet he acknowledged the power they carried. Humans need meaning. They need stories to make sense of suffering. And the death of the Templar order, carried out through lies, greed, and cruelty, demanded explanation. The people found that explanation not in legal decrees, but in the idea that truth had spoken through fire. But while myths grew, real consequences unfolded quietly, like cracks spreading through stone. Templar properties were seized, scattered, repurposed. Their commanderies, once alive with prayer, strategy, and brotherhood, became empty shells. Horses that had carried knights into battle were sold at auction. Chapels were stripped of relics. Libraries once filled with knowledge were dismantled and absorbed into other institutions. Europe lost more than warriors. It lost custodians, financiers, architects, builders, inventors, navigators, and a network of disciplined men who brought order to dangerous roads, protection to vulnerable travelers, and stability to fragile economies. Crime surged on pilgrimage routes once patrolled by Templars. Bandits reclaimed old hunting grounds. Merchants traveled with fear again, hiring untrained guards instead of relying on the disciplined protection they once took for granted. Even the Church felt the loss, though it refused to admit it. Without the Templars' funding and logistical support, its reach across distant lands shrank. Diplomacy faltered. Missions weakened. Entire regions fell into disarray. The unnamed Templar would later write that Europe did not realize what it had destroyed. It believed it was pruning a diseased branch, but it had uprooted a vital tree. And beyond the practical losses, something else shifted, something harder to measure yet more profound. The execution ignited doubt. Not open rebellion, but a quiet unease that threaded through conversations and hearts. People began questioning authority, not loudly but inwardly. They wondered how an order blessed by the Church could be condemned by the same Church. They wondered how knights sworn to poverty could be accused of greed. They wondered why confessions extracted through torture were accepted as justice. For many, the burning of de Molay became a symbol, not of Templar guilt, but of royal fear, corruption, and the fragility of earthly power. The unnamed Templar felt this shift even within the prison walls. Guards who once mocked the knights now lowered their eyes. Priests who had preached sermons against the order now delivered them with a tremor of uncertainty. The world smelled of smoke, he wrote, and smoke carries truth in ways words cannot. But the deepest consequence was the birth of legend. As the Templar order crumbled, its myth rose. Not the myth fabricated by the king, the lies of heresy and corruption, but a different myth, the one forged by memory, sacrifice, and injustice. Stories spread of hidden treasures, secret teachings, knights who escaped to distant lands, a wisdom preserved rather than destroyed. Some of these tales were exaggerations. Some were fabrications. Some were rooted in truth that still lies buried beneath centuries of dust. What mattered was not their accuracy, but their endurance. The ruin of the order created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured imagination, longing, and the human desire to believe that something pure cannot be fully extinguished. The unnamed Templar did not believe in grand myths. He believed in the simple truths revealed in suffering. He wrote that what survived the fall of the Templars was not gold, not relics, not secret rituals, but the resilience of the human spirit. He described Europe after the execution as a land haunted, searching for the meaning of what it had lost. The continent grieved without realizing it. It mourned not just the deaths of knights, but the death of an age that believed courage and faith could coexist with power. What rose from the ruins was not an institution. It was an idea that no king, no pope, no flame could destroy. That idea would travel quietly through the generations, carried by whispers, hidden manuscripts, scattered survivors, and the lingering memory of a man who burned in silence but refused to bow. Europe would rebuild. Kings would rise and fall. Wars would reshape borders. But the echo of the Templars, the echo birthed in flames, would remain. It would live in the cracks between history and legend, in the stories told by candlelight, in the manuscript held in trembling hands centuries later. The order was gone, but its voice, its spirit, its quiet teachings, those lived on in the ruins, waiting for the right time to emerge again. They scattered like embers carried by a restless wind, not disappearing, but drifting far from the blaze that had consumed their brothers. When the Templar order fell, it did not fall uniformly. Some knights were arrested immediately. Others fled before soldiers reached their commanderies. Still others were simply away on duty, patrolling pilgrimage roads or escorting caravans across the Mediterranean. And when news reached them of the arrests and executions, they did not gather to fight. They vanished, quietly, purposefully. They became wanderers, pilgrims, mercenaries, hermits, sailors, stonemasons, priests, farmers. The Templars who survived the purge did not cling to their old identities, because doing so would have meant death. Instead, they carried their vows inward, wearing their discipline like invisible armor. Europe no longer recognized them as knights, but they continued to live as men shaped by the same fire that had taken their brothers. The unnamed Templar wrote of these scattered survivors with reverence, though he himself never walked free again. He imagined their journeys through the fragments of stories whispered by guards, smuggled notes, and rumors carried into the prison by sympathetic monks. These men, he wrote, became pilgrims of the unseen, carrying not relics or treasures, but the memory of what the order once stood for. Some fled north to Scotland, where King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Church, had no reason to betray them to Philip IV. Scottish chronicles make subtle, cryptic references to foreign knights, arriving during the Wars of Independence, fighting with uncanny discipline at the Battle of Bannockburn. Scholars argue endlessly about whether these knights were Templars or merely experienced mercenaries. But the unnamed Templar wrote, "A man trained in the ways of the temple fights with silence, with patience, with purpose. You can see it even when he wears no cross." Others traveled west to Portugal. Unlike France, Portugal did not turn against its Templar knights. King Denis protected them, quietly reshaping the remnants of the order into a new institution, the Order of Christ. There, former Templars continued to serve as guardians, explorers, and advisors, laying foundations that would one day fuel the Portuguese age of discovery. It is said that the discipline, navigation skills, and silent philosophical traditions of the Templars seeped into the culture of the explorers who would cross oceans a century later. Some survivors fled east, not toward familiarity, but toward solitude. They became hermits in the mountains of Armenia, Cappadocia, or the rugged plains near the old Crusader states. These were men too wounded by betrayal to trust nations again. They carved small chapels into stone, lived in silence, and prayed for brothers lost to fire and chains. Travelers passing through these regions would sometimes speak of solitary warriors who offered water, guidance, or protection, refusing payment of any kind. A smaller number became mercenaries, not for gold, but for purpose. They offered their experience to kings, merchants, or local lords, fighting not for loyalty to a throne, but to protect innocent lives. It is said that such men never stayed in one place long. They fought, then vanished, leaving behind puzzling examples of unexpected discipline in armies otherwise known for chaos. And then there were those who blended into ordinary life: bakers, shepherds, masons, scribes, carpenters. These were the ones who chose anonymity over adventure. Yet even in their hidden roles, the habits of their past clung to them. Neighbors might have noticed how they rose before dawn, how they prayed in silence rather than in groups, how they worked with unwavering focus, how they helped strangers without hesitation, how they stood straighter than most men. One legend tells of a small village in the Alps where a mysterious shepherd arrived one winter. He carried nothing but a cloak, a wooden staff, and eyes that looked haunted. Over the years, he tended his flock with unusual devotion, protected the villagers from bandits, and disappeared each night into the mountains to pray beneath the stars. Only decades later, when he died, did the villagers discover a faded red cross stitched into the lining of his cloak. The unnamed Templar believed these wanderers were more than survivors. He believed they were seeds, scattered across Europe and beyond, carrying fragments of the Order's spirit into places where it could grow quietly. He wrote, "The Order did not die. It walked into the world wearing many faces. What united the scattered Templars was not identity, but philosophy. They carried with them the quiet teachings of the hidden brotherhood, the reflections born of deserts, aftermaths, prisons, and loss. They whispered these teachings to the few who earned their trust, not in grand sermons, but in simple conversations shared during long journeys, nights around fires, or moments when another soul looked close to breaking. The teachings spread not like doctrine but like comfort, a reminder to endure, a reminder to rise after falling, a reminder that strength is built slowly, patiently, through suffering transformed. These wandering knights became living vessels of the manuscript long before the manuscript itself resurfaced. Even without parchment, their actions carried its essence. A mercenary who refused to abandon a wounded comrade. A hermit who sheltered lost travelers during storms. A mason who worked with such precision and devotion that his structures outlived kingdoms. A soldier who prayed not for victory, but for peace. The unnamed Templar wrote that such men were echoes of a broken order. Yet their quiet lives shaped the world more than any king who sought to erase them. And somewhere, generations later, in an abandoned cloister or forgotten archive, the manuscript found by chance would feel familiar to those who read it, because the spirit within it had already traveled through flesh and blood, carried by the survivors who wandered on. Templars disappeared from history, but they remained in the world, in the choices of men who walked with discipline, in the compassion of wanderers who gave more than they took, in the quiet strength of those who endured heartbreak with dignity. They became the unseen guardians of ordinary life. Not knights of a grand order, but knights of the human spirit. And so the order lived on. Not in fortresses or chapels, but in footsteps, in stories, in whispers, in the lives of men who refused to let the flame go out. The manuscript did not reappear in a blaze of revelation. There was no triumphant discovery, no royal archive swinging open, no dramatic unveiling before scholars. It resurfaced quietly, in the way that most truths return to the world. Softly, humbly, almost as if asking permission to exist again. Centuries had passed since the unnamed Templar pressed charcoal to parchment in the flickering light of a forbidden candle. Europe had transformed countless times. Empires had risen and fallen. Languages had evolved. Wars had reshaped borders. Entire civilizations had been born and buried. And yet, somewhere in the shadows of those centuries, the manuscript moved through hands that protected it, hidden in silence, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The most widely accepted account of its rediscovery begins in the remnants of a crumbling cloister, a monastery abandoned long before historians arrived to catalog its ruins. The structure sat on the edge of a forest, its stones covered in moss, its corridors lost to vines, its windows broken by storms. For generations, no one had lived there. Only wind and time walked through its halls. It was during restoration work in the late 18th century that two stonemasons, men hired to dismantle part of the ruined cloister, uncovered an anomaly. Behind the altar, beneath several layers of loose stones, they found a hollow compartment. Inside it lay a sealed wooden chest, surprisingly well preserved despite the decay around it. The chest bore no decoration, no emblem of the Templars, no inscription revealing its origins. That simplicity made it even more intriguing. The Masons assumed it held relics or perhaps some forgotten valuables. But when the chest was opened, they found only a small bundle wrapped in linen, tied with a thin leather strap. The linen was brittle, stained by time, and fragile as dried leaves. When unwrapped, it revealed several sheets of parchment. Faded, blistered at the edges, but unmistakably ancient. The men, realizing this was no ordinary find, delivered the bundle to a local priest. He recognized the Latin script immediately, but the tone of the writing puzzled him. This was not a sermon, not a liturgical text, not an account of monastic life. It felt like a confession, a reflection, a private exploration of suffering and hope. The priest, sensing its value, passed it to a scholar he trusted, a historian who specialized in medieval religious orders. That scholar would later write in his journal, "I expected a relic. I found a soul." The manuscript did not reveal itself easily. The ink had faded so much that portions were nearly invisible. The parchment crumbled at the edges when handled roughly. The symbols in the margins baffled even those familiar with medieval ciphers. But the more scholars studied it, the clearer it became that this was something rare. Not an administrative document, not a piece of propaganda, but a deeply personal account. The handwriting matched no known Templar records, strengthening the theory that the author had written it secretly, without scribes or formal copying. The scorch marks supported the idea that the manuscript had narrowly escaped destruction during the purge. The water stains suggested a long journey, perhaps smuggled across rivers or hidden during storms. The coded symbols confirmed that the writer belonged to a contemplative circle within the order. But the most astonishing realization came when scholars compared the manuscript's themes to surviving Templar letters and testimonies. The philosophical tone was unlike any official Templar doctrine. It blended spirituality with emotional insight. It spoke to the broken, the weary, the wounded, not to kings, not to priests, not to crusaders. This wasn't a chronicle. It was a lifeline. Scholars debated endlessly. Was the author a high-ranking knight who had grown disillusioned? Was he a young brother who matured through suffering? Was he the final voice of an order dying in flames? Or was he something else entirely? A man who had glimpsed truths no institution had prepared him for? The section of the manuscript that gripped scholars most deeply was not its teachings, but the emotion behind them. The writer spoke as if he knew his words would be read by someone who themselves stood at the edge of despair. It was written not to preserve history, but to preserve hope. Once the first translations appeared in academic circles, rumors spread quickly. The manuscript's gentleness, its wisdom, its unguarded honesty felt revolutionary for a document born in an age defined by war, dogma, and brutality. People who read it reported feeling as though the writer were sitting beside them, speaking directly into their lives. A century later, a new generation of scholars rediscovered the text again, this time through the lens of psychology and philosophy. They noted that many of the manuscript's teachings paralleled modern understandings of trauma, resilience, and emotional healing. Its insights were not medieval, they were universal. And so the manuscript gained a second life. Not as an artifact locked in a museum, not as a relic of a fallen military order, but as a voice, a quiet, compassionate voice echoing across time. It was copied, translated, shared in pieces. Artists illustrated its lines. Philosophers debated its implications. Clergy quoted it in sermons. Soldiers carried small transcriptions in their pockets. Even prisoners smuggled its words between cells, finding comfort in sentences written by a man who had once suffered the same confinement. The unnamed Templar could never have imagined this. He wrote by candlelight, believing his words would die with him. He wrote in chains, believing he had already been forgotten. He wrote with trembling hands, believing no one would ever understand. And yet his voice rose again, across centuries, across nations, across cultures. The manuscript's second life became a testament not to the Templar order, but to the endurance of compassion, truth, and human connection. It became proof that even in the darkest moments, when the world tries to erase you, when your voice is silenced, when your body is broken, your words can find a way to survive. It became proof that wisdom born of suffering never truly dies. It waits. It watches. It whispers. The manuscript lived a second life not because history preserved it, but because the world needed it again. And so, centuries after his death, the unnamed Templar finally spoke. Not from a pulpit, not from a battlefield, not from a throne, but from a fragile bundle of parchment pulled from the ruins of a forgotten cloister. A voice reborn, a message rekindled, a truth carried forward, ready to guide anyone facing their own brokenness, just as it had guided its author through his. It was only after the manuscript's rediscovery, after scholars dusted off its fragile pages and the world began reading its quiet truths, that people recognized what it truly was. It was not a historical record or a chronicle of war. It was not a confession, nor a theological treatise. It was something far more unexpected, far more intimate. A guide for the broken. No Templar rulebook had ever spoken this way. No military code had ever offered such gentleness. Yet every line of the manuscript radiated a profound, lived compassion. The kind that only exists in someone who has suffered deeply and survived with empathy instead of bitterness. The unnamed Templar had written not for the powerful or the righteous, but for those who felt lost, exhausted, and fractured by life. His words were not meant for kings. They were not meant for scholars. They were meant for anyone who might one day find themselves on their knees, unsure how to stand again. Readers noticed that the manuscript shifted in tone during its middle and later sections. The early passages told of hardship, loss, and betrayal, but the later ones began offering something else. Guidance. Not instructions. Not lessons. Not rules, but gentle reminders, reflections shaped by the weight of captivity and the clarity that suffering brings. He wrote as though speaking directly to someone sitting across from him, someone trembling, someone tired. There was no judgment in his voice, no superiority, only understanding. He wrote, "When you feel yourself breaking, know that breaking is not an end. It is the first shape of beginning." This line, simple yet profound, touched generations of readers. It did not deny pain. It did not trivialize it. Instead, it reframed pain as a transformation, a necessary unraveling before renewal. Another line appeared beside one of the manuscript's coded symbols. "You are not asked to be unbroken. You are asked to endure." This distinction became one of the manuscript's most quoted truths. The modern world obsessed over perfection, strength, resilience as a performance. But the Templar reminded his invisible reader that enduring, simply continuing, was itself an act of courage. He understood suffering in a way few others did. He understood how it twists the heart, fogs the mind, and makes the world seem small. He did not pretend suffering was noble. He did not dress it in poetic illusions. He acknowledged it for what it was, a fire that burns everything that is not essential. And then he wrote, "What remains, that is who you are." The manuscript became a mirror for anyone who had ever felt lost. The Templar wrote about grief as though it were an old companion. Grief is the shadow of love. You cannot chase it away, but you can walk with it. He wrote about fear as though he had carried it beside him for years. Do not shame yourself for fear. The brave are not those who feel no fear, but those who walk with it quietly. He wrote about despair not as a failure, but as a part of the human condition. When despair visits, do not fight it as an enemy. Sit with it. Listen. It will tell you where the wound is. These were not the words of a trained philosopher. They were the words of a man who had sat in a prison cell, eyes swollen from tears, body trembling from torture, faith cracked but still flickering. A man who had lost everything, comrades, purpose, identity, and yet somehow found wisdom in the ruins of his life. His reflections carried an emotional clarity centuries ahead of modern psychology. He understood that healing was nonlinear, that strength was inconsistent, that the human spirit grew in cycles. He understood that people do not need lectures. They need reminders that they are not alone. And so the manuscript addressed the reader as if addressing a friend across a dying campfire. You are tired. I know. Rest if you must. But when you rise, rise slowly, and let your rising be your prayer. Modern readers found this deeply comforting. Survivors of war, victims of loss, people enduring heartbreak, illness, depression, all felt as though the Templars spoke directly to them. Not with pity, but with companionship. The manuscript became a universal balm because it avoided grand promises. It offered no guarantees of victory, no assurances of easy healing, no hollow encouragement. Instead, it offered honesty, hope that was quiet, humble, realistic, strength that was gentle, human, imperfect. It taught that rebuilding is not dramatic. It is slow, patient, and often unseen. It taught that the soul bends without breaking if tended with compassion. It taught that suffering shapes wisdom not through force, but through endurance. It taught that life wounds us, and those wounds can become windows rather than prisons. What made the manuscript remarkable was not its historical significance, but its emotional truth. Its focus on internal battles rather than external ones. Its understanding that the greatest wars are not fought on battlefields, but within the self. For countless readers, the manuscript became an anchor, a companion during dark nights, a gentle voice when the world felt too heavy, and in a beautiful, almost poetic irony, it fulfilled the exact purpose its author could not have foreseen. A Templar, broken by a kingdom, became a quiet guide for broken souls across centuries. The unnamed Templar's message resonated because it was not about him. It was about anyone who had ever felt lost, anyone who had ever felt afraid, anyone who had ever faced life's cruelty and wondered if they could continue. And his answer, written in trembling charcoal strokes, was always the same: yes, you can continue, not because you are unbroken, but because you choose to rise. Section 21 marked the moment the manuscript transformed from a relic of history into a gift for the human spirit. A message that the struggles of one man, carried across centuries, could light the path for countless others learning how to rebuild themselves from the inside out. He wrote this section with a gravity that felt different from the rest, heavier, sharper, as if every word had been drawn from the deepest place in his being. If earlier parts of the manuscript whispered comfort, this part spoke with a quiet fire. It was here that the unnamed Templar revealed one of the most profound truths he had learned through battlefields, deserts, and prison walls. Faith will fail you, but courage never will. Not faith in the religious sense alone, but faith in people, in plans, in institutions, in oneself. He had believed that faith was the anchor that kept a man steady. Yet, in the darkest moments of his life, he discovered that faith could crack, could wobble, could weaken under pressure, could even vanish for a time. He wrote with disarming honesty about this. There were nights when I prayed and felt nothing, nights when I begged for strength and found only silence, nights when God seemed farther away than the stars I could not see. No Templar was supposed to admit this. Their vows demanded unwavering devotion, unshakable certainty. But the unnamed Templar had discovered a truth too powerful to keep hidden. Belief does not always answer suffering. Faith does not always shield the heart. There are nights when a man feels utterly forsaken. And yet, he continued. This, he realized, was courage. Not the courage sung in songs or praised in courts. Not the dramatic courage of charging into battle. But the quiet courage of waking up each day after one feels broken. The courage of breathing through pain. The courage of moving forward even when the road ahead is invisible. He wrote, "When faith trembles, courage speaks. When hope dims, courage lights the smallest lamp." To him, courage was not the opposite of fear. It was fear's companion. A man did not become brave by eliminating fear, but by allowing courage to walk beside his fear like a trusted brother. He recalled moments from the battlefield, when young knights froze at the sight of enemy formations stretching across the horizon. Some trembled. Some whispered prayers. Some felt their faith crack. But in those moments, it was not faith that pushed them forward. It was courage, quiet and steady, guiding their feet even when their minds faltered. He wrote of one particular battle years before his arrest, where he and several brothers defended a caravan of pilgrims attacked by bandits. The odds were terrible. Fear raced through them like a storm. But something remarkable happened. They formed a circle around the pilgrims, not because they believed they would win, but because they could not bear to abandon those who depended on them. This, he said, was courage. Courage is born not of certainty, but of compassion. In captivity, he saw courage again, not in defiance or rebellion, but in the smallest acts. A brother who whispered a prayer for another. A man who, though starving, shared his last scrap of bread. A knight who held another's hand through torture. A dying man who reminded others that they were not alone. He wrote, "These men were not fearless. They were afraid every hour. But they chose to act with love despite fear. This is courage. This is holiness." It was an astonishing statement for a medieval warrior monk. He did not define holiness through rituals, rules, or doctrine, but through courage shaped by compassion. He insisted that courage was a sacred act, equal to prayer. When you rise after falling, heaven sees it. Your rise is a prayer. Your endurance is a psalm. The idea that courage itself was a form of spiritual expression was incredibly ahead of its time. But to him, it was simple truth. After facing betrayal, torture, and the destruction of everything he had sworn to protect, he realized that courage was the only constant in a world full of broken promises. He admitted that faith had abandoned him at times. Faith in the church, faith in kings, faith in the order's safety. Even faith in God himself wavered under the weight of suffering. But courage remained. It was courage that allowed him to write when his hands trembled. Courage that kept him alive when he wanted to surrender. Courage that whispered to him in the darkness, "Get up, just once more, get up." Near the end of this section, he wrote one of the most powerful lines in the manuscript. "Faith is a star in the sky. Courage is the flame you carry in your hands." Faith can be obscured by clouds, by darkness, by doubt. But courage, even the smallest ember, can be carried, protected, and nurtured. The Templar also understood that courage was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, almost invisible. It lived in choices made out of love, out of loyalty, out of sheer stubborn refusal to be swallowed by despair. This section also described how courage grows. It grows when shared. A single spark becomes a fire when held among brothers. He had seen courage multiply among his brothers in captivity. One man whispering encouragement, another lifting a fallen companion, another enduring torture to protect the innocent. Courage, he realized, is contagious. A flame passed from hand to trembling hand. In one haunting passage, he wrote, "If faith is the crown, courage is the throne beneath it," meaning, faith may inspire a man, but courage sustains him. By the end of this section, his perspective had shifted entirely. He no longer believed that strength meant perfection. He believed it meant resilience. He no longer believed that doubt weakened a man. He believed it refined him. He no longer believed that God abandoned the broken. He believed God entrusted the broken with a fire only suffering could ignite. This chapter became one of the manuscript's most beloved portions because it reframed struggle in a way that felt profoundly human. You do not need to feel strong to be strong. You do not need perfect faith to continue. You do not need certainty to move forward. Courage is enough. Quiet, trembling, persistent courage. And for countless readers across centuries, that message, written by a man who had been stripped of everything, became a lifeline. It told them that they did not need to be saints to endure. They did not need unshakable faith to survive. They only needed the courage to take one more step, rise one more time, breathe one more breath. Because courage, the Templar wrote, is the voice that remains when everything else falls silent. The final pages of the manuscript felt different, not in ink or structure, but in spirit. They carried the weight of a man who knew he was writing his last words, yet carried the tenderness of someone who wanted those words to outlive him with purpose. There was no despair in these final lines. No bitterness. No anger at kings, popes, or captors. What filled the parchment instead was a quiet, unwavering light. The kind that appears after a long night when the first hint of dawn finally touches the horizon. This section was not written for history, not for scholars, not for vindication. It was written for you, the unnamed reader, the future soul, the one he believed would one day hold his words and see themselves in his journey. It was a message passed like a torch across centuries. A final offering from a man who had nothing left except the truth of his experience. He began with reflection. I have been broken many times. Not once did my breaking mean my end. These words revealed a profound shift in the Templars' understanding of life. To him, suffering was not merely an obstacle. It was a sculptor, shaping him into something truer, gentler, wiser than he had been before. He no longer feared the fractures of his spirit. He embraced them as openings through which light could enter. He wrote, "The world will break you, not out of malice, but because breaking is how the heart learns its strength." Here, he touched a truth that resonates even now. That pain is not a punishment but a shaping force, and that those who endure it with honesty become something deeper than unbroken men ever could. Then he turned his attention outward, beyond his cell, beyond his time. He imagined someone centuries later, perhaps sitting alone in their room, wrestling with grief or anxiety, overwhelmed by the weight of life, reading his words, and he addressed that invisible reader directly. You who hold this, you who read this with trembling hands, know that I am with you. This line stunned scholars. It was as if he anticipated the emotional power his words would carry long after his death. As if he understood that human suffering does not change across eras, only its surroundings do. He continued, Your burden may not be a chain, nor a cell, nor the judgment of kings. Yet pain is pain and the heart knows it well. In these lines he bridged centuries effortlessly, dissolving the distance between his world and ours. He made clear that struggle is universal. Whether born of war, betrayal, loss, illness, heartbreak, or inner turmoil, all suffering speaks the same language. The unnamed Templar did not try to offer solutions. He offered companionship. He offered understanding. He offered presence. Do not walk your night alone, he wrote. Let my words be a lantern in your hand. This metaphor returned again and again in his writing. The lantern, the candle, the fragile flame that persists despite wind and darkness. It symbolized hope not as a blaze, but as a small, trembling light a person must protect with their own hands. He knew the reader would face their own darkness. He knew they would break. He knew they would doubt. And so he wrote the sentence that became the heart of the entire manuscript. When life breaks you down, let this build you back up. Not the order, not the church, not the past, not doctrine. This, the wisdom carved from pain, the compassion forged in suffering, the courage born in silence. He believed that what he had endured, betrayal, torture, isolation, the death of his brothers, the destruction of his world, could become fuel for someone else's healing. His suffering would not be wasted if it helped another person rise. He wrote, What I could not give in life, let me give in words. Then, as the manuscript neared its final lines, he turned once more to the idea of rising. A theme he had carried since the desert, since the candle in his cell, since his transformation in the deepest dark. If you have fallen, rise. If you cannot rise, rest. And when you are ready, rise again. This was not a command. It was permission. Permission to heal slowly. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to be human. He emphasized that strength does not appear all at once. It is grown through small acts, repeated deliberately, through breathing, through waiting, through believing that even the smallest ember can become a flame. His final reflection was a blessing, not formal or ritualistic, but deeply personal. May your night carry a dawn within it. May your wounds teach you. May your courage outlast your fear. And when your time comes to speak into the dark, may your words guide another as these words have guided you. And then, at the very bottom of the final page, scholars found one last line. Just 6 words, written smaller, softer, almost like a whisper across time. Carry the light. Someone will need it. With that, the manuscript ended. No signature. No name. No claim to glory. Just a final offering from a man who believed his suffering could become someone else's strength. Section 23 stands as the emotional culmination of the entire manuscript. The moment where the Templar's voice transcends history and speaks directly into the heart of anyone who has ever felt lost. It is the point where the past reaches forward, touches the present, and reminds the reader of a truth older than kingdoms, older than wars, older than the Templars themselves. Brokenness is not the end. Rising is possible, and even the smallest light can save a life. This was his legacy, not an order, not a treasure, not a secret. A message, a voice through time, and a flame passed into your hands. The final section of the manuscript, the part scholars later called the Quiet Reckoning, did not describe an event, a battle, or even a memory. Instead, it unfolded like a slow awakening, a gentle closing of the world behind the unnamed Templar as he prepared not for death, but for acceptance. These pages carried a tone unlike any other part of the text. They were spacious, unhurried, and filled with a calm that could only come from someone who had made peace with everything he had endured. This section was not written in fear or urgency. It was written in stillness, in the kind of clarity that comes only when a man knows he has nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to protect. The unnamed Templar no longer wrote as a warrior, nor as a prisoner, nor even as a teacher. He wrote as a witness to the full arc of his life, to the rise and fall of his order, to the breaking and mending of his own spirit. He began by reflecting on the strange symmetry of existence. I was trained to build fortresses of stone, yet all along, I was learning to build fortresses within myself. He understood now that the walls he once trusted, commanderies, rituals, brotherhood, vows were temporary. But the inner fortress, the quiet place carved through suffering and reflection, endured. He spoke of the subtle transformation that had taken years of hardship to understand. That which is taken from you is not your life. What you give freely, that becomes your life. It was a reversal of everything he had been taught as a knight. He once believed life was defined by accomplishments, victories, loyalties, and oaths. But here, in the quiet closure of his manuscript, he reached a profound truth. Meaning came not from what he had held, but from what he had released. He wrote that losing the order forced him to recognize a deeper purpose, not tied to institutions or identities, but to the simple act of being human. To be a knight is to serve. To be human is to understand. He no longer glorified the Templars as a perfect brotherhood. He acknowledged their flaws, their ambition, their blindness to the politics that eventually devoured them. And yet, he honored the intentions that had guided them at their best. Compassion, discipline, courage, faith. But he did not stop there. He looked beyond his brothers, beyond himself, to the mysterious unfolding of history itself. He wrote, "What falls may rise again in another form. What ends may begin again in another heart." He believed that nothing truly vanished. Not ideas, not courage, not truth. They transformed, passed from one generation to another, shaped by each soul that carried them. This led him into one of the most philosophical passages of the entire manuscript. He began questioning the nature of legacy itself. Not the legacy of a military order, but the legacy of an individual life. Ask not what you leave behind in stone or record. Ask what light you leave in others. For a man who had once believed in the immortal glory of the Templars, this shift was monumental. He now saw legacy not as a monument, but as a ripple, a quiet influence passed through compassion, courage, and truth. He described legacy like a seed scattered in unknown soil. You may never see the tree that grows from the seed you plant. Plant it anyway. It was this surrender, the release of control over how he would be remembered, that marked the deepest turning point in his spirit. He no longer desired recognition, no longer sought justice, no longer wished for vindication. His only wish was that his words might help someone rise where he himself once fell. Then came a stretch of writing in which the Templar reflected on time, not as a linear march but as a circle. He believed that suffering and healing, despair and hope, faith and doubt all moved in cycles, returning to the human heart in different seasons. He wrote, "Time is not river or arrow. Time is breath. It expands and contracts with the soul." This poetic image showed how deeply he had shifted from the rigid medieval worldview into something mystic, almost timeless. He imagined his words traveling across centuries like a quiet echo carried by wind. He imagined them reaching lands he had never heard of, people he could not imagine, hearts shaped by struggles he could not name. He imagined someone, perhaps you, reading his reflections during their own darkest night. And he offered them this: "I did not survive so that you would revere me. I survived so that you would not feel alone." Here, the manuscript transcended history entirely. It became a bridge, connecting a broken knight in a medieval cell to a broken soul in any era. He wrote that pain connects humans across time more deeply than victory ever could, and that the courage we show in our darkest moments becomes a gift to others, even if we never meet them. He then offered a final reflection: "The world will forget my name. Let it. Names fade. But the light we kindle in one another, that is the true memory." In these lines, the unnamed Templar embraced anonymity. He accepted that history would not remember him. He accepted that his brothers were gone. He accepted that the world he knew had collapsed. And yet, he found peace in the idea that his inner transformation, born of suffering, could guide someone else toward their own dawn. The last paragraphs of section 24 carried an almost meditative rhythm. He urged the reader to listen to their own pain without fear, to honor their own wounds, to see themselves not as shattered, but as reshaped. "You are not the storm that breaks you. You are the sky that holds it." And then, in words that feel like a soft breath closing the manuscript, he wrote, "Go forward gently. Your story is not over. Even now, it is beginning again." Section 24 is the moment the Templar stops being a historical figure and becomes a companion, whispering across time, reminding the reader that endurance is a form of grace, and that every soul carries a dawn waiting to rise. It is the reckoning not of a knight, not of a prisoner, but of a human being who has finally understood his own purpose, to light the path for whoever comes next. The final section of the documentary, the last echo of the manuscript's voice, is not a conclusion in the usual sense. It is not an ending, nor a fade to black. It is a return to the listener, the viewer, the modern soul searching for meaning amidst their own storms. Section 25 is where the unnamed Templar's words step out of history completely and enter the present, placing a gentle but unmistakable responsibility into the hands of the one who hears him. If Section 24 was acceptance, Section 25 is invitation. A call, a question, a challenge whispered in the softest tone possible. The manuscript's final pages are sparse, yet weighty. The ink grows lighter, the lines shorter, the handwriting slower. It is clear the Templar was nearing the end of his strength, yet the clarity of his thoughts only sharpens. He knew his life was closing, but he also knew something else. His words could only transform the world if the reader chooses to carry them forward. He begins section 25 not with reflection, but with a direct address, a rare shift that scholars say marks the true heart of the manuscript. "You who rise from your darkness, remember this. The world needs the light you gather." He understood something profound, that healing is not selfish. Healing is generational. You do not rise merely for yourself. You rise because someone else, someday, will need the strength you gained by surviving. He expands, "Every step you take out of the night becomes a path for another. Walk with courage. Walk with tenderness." This is where the Templar stops being a soldier, a victim, or even a teacher. He becomes a bridge, not from past to present, but from wound to wisdom. He writes that the hardest lesson he ever learned was this: you are not meant to keep your strength to yourself. Strength is a circulating force. Hope is a shared fire. Light is a chain passed from trembling hand to trembling hand. He insists that the reader does not need to be a knight, or devout, or heroic, or perfect. They need only be willing to rise, willing to carry the small flame within them, willing to hand that flame to someone else when their moment arrives. He clarifies, the world is not saved by great acts. The world is saved by the quiet courage of ordinary hearts. In this final reflection, the manuscript reveals its ultimate meaning. The Templar was not trying to preserve his order. He was trying to preserve the human spirit. The Templars had risen and fallen. Kingdoms came and went. Churches divided and merged. But the inner resilience of the human heart, that was eternal and worth fighting for. The Templar then offers a truth that feels almost modern in its emotional intelligence. There will come a day when someone you love will break. Remember what carried you and carry them. He believed that resilience is not a solitary practice. It is communal. We rise because someone once lifted us. We heal because someone before us learned to. We endure because someone showed us how. He adds, let your compassion be the armor you wear. Let your kindness be the blade you carry. In these lines, he redefines knighthood itself. No longer is it tied to violence or vows. It becomes a metaphor for living with integrity in a wounded world. Anyone who chooses love over bitterness, courage over fear, gentleness over cruelty, they become, in the Templar's words, a knight of the quiet light. The Templar then turns to the manuscript itself. He acknowledges that its survival is a miracle he never expected. He writes, if these words have reached you, then the darkness did not win. This is the manuscript's emotional crescendo, the realization that everything he suffered, everything he wrote in the shadows of his cell, has become part of a larger story, a story not about the Templars, but about endurance itself. He then issues a final challenge. Do not let the light end with you. He asks the reader to speak kindness where there is cruelty, to offer comfort where there is despair, to be a lantern for someone else's night. And then, almost unbelievably, he gives permission for the reader to surpass him. Go further than I could, heal deeper than I did, live brighter than I was allowed. He understood that his life was cut short, but hoped that yours would not be. The very last paragraph of section 25 feels like a benediction whispered at the threshold of dawn. When your path grows dark, remember this. You are the descendant of every survivor who came before you. Their strength is in you. My strength is in you. Walk on. And then, at the bottom corner of the final page, not centered, not formal, but written as if he leaned close to the parchment and whispered it, there is one last line. Carry the light forward. No signature, no date, just a mission. Section 25 is the moment where the Templar's voice passes entirely from the realm of history into the hands of the modern reader. It transforms the manuscript from a relic of a fallen order into a living call to resilience. It reminds us that even in a world full of ruin, betrayal, loss, and darkness, the quiet human act of rising, again and again, is itself a rebellion, a victory, a legacy. The Templar's final message is simple, timeless, and immeasurably powerful. If life breaks you, rise. And when you rise, carry a light bright enough for someone else to see.